It began quietly, almost too quietly for such a remarkable visitor. A faint point of light traced across the detectors of a telescope high in the Chilean Andes, no brighter than countless others scattered against the black canvas of the sky. Yet this subtle flicker marked the arrival of something extraordinary, an interstellar traveller drifting into our solar system from the deep silence between the stars. Astronomers gave it a name, 3i Atlas, a string of letters and numbers that seemed too modest for a body that had journeyed for perhaps billions of years. What captured attention was not just its speed or trajectory, but the way it seemed to bend statistical possibility. Its path wove past Mars, brushed close to Venus, and skimmed Jupiter with a precision that looked less like accident and more like design. As the data accumulated, questions grew. Was this an ancient comet forged in the cold outskirts of another star system? Or could it be something far stranger, a disguised probe quietly surveying our worlds? Some scientists compared it to earlier visitors, Oumuamua, elongated and enigmatic, and Borisov, bright and more typical. Yet 3 Atlas sat between categories, refusing to be pinned down. In that ambiguity lay its mystery. Tonight we follow its story together, exploring how science, imagination and wonder intertwined around a single drifting fragment of the cosmos. You're watching Arcane Skies. If you enjoy this gentle descent into celestial enigmas, feel free to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world and at what hour you are joining us now. When we look up at the night sky, it is easy to forget how much of what we see is a matter of chance. Stars appear fixed, but they too are travellers, moving along invisible lines that only reveal themselves across vast scales of time. Against this shifting backdrop, our instruments caught a new spark, an unremarkable flicker at first, yet destined to raise questions about the very boundaries between natural wonder and deliberate design. The date was July the 1st, 2025. The hour, just past 11 in Coordinated Universal Time. At that moment, an automated telescope in Chile, part of the Atlas survey whose name fittingly means Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, logged an entry that would soon ripple outward into headlines, podcasts and whispered speculations about cosmic visitors. A faint dot catalogued without ceremony as A1PL3Z appeared on the screen, shifting ever so slightly from its expected position. To the operators on duty, it was the sort of entry that fills nightly logs by the thousands. Only later, when other observatories confirmed the motion, did the object begin to take on a personality, as if a veil had lifted and a stranger had stepped into our shared neighbourhood of planets. It was not the first time humanity had glimpsed something drifting in from interstellar space. In 2017, the long, thin body called Oumuamua passed through, tumbling end over end, as if it were a sliver of stone chipped off a galactic sculpture. Its acceleration puzzled astronomers and provoked endless debates, some insisting it might be a relic of technology. 2 years later, Borisov arrived, brighter, icy, leaving the unmistakable trail of a comet. That one felt more familiar, a frozen ball set loose from some distant nursery. But this new arrival, this 3i Atlas, carried a weight of ambiguity. It was larger, or so the first measurement said, possibly 20 kilometres across, which would have made it the most massive interstellar wanderer ever observed. Yet within days, revised calculations shrank its estimate, halving it, halving again, until it seemed almost shy, retreating into the modest scale of a mere few hundred metres. A body that appeared too big, then too small, as though it resisted classification. Observers could not agree whether it was giant or minuscule, a world fragment or a shard of something built. The intrigue deepened when its trajectory was plotted. Objects from beyond our system are expected to cut through space at random angles, like pebbles skipping on a cosmic pond. But Atlas, with almost theatrical precision, brushed past the major worlds of our inner system. It skimmed within a cosmic hair's breadth of Mars, veered near Venus, arced by Jupiter, each encounter close enough to count as meaningful. The odds of such a path occurring naturally were vanishingly small, less than a fraction of a percent according to some statistical models. To stumble upon such a route by chance would be like throwing a pebble from one side of an ocean and hitting the sails of 3 different ships in motion. This improbability stirred whispers. Was it coincidence? Or choreography? Adding to the puzzle was its behaviour as it approached the warmth of the sun. Natural comets, when heated, put on a show. Jets of gas, long tails that sweep like banners in the solar wind. Atlas, however, seemed restrained. A faint halo, yes, a coma of gas and dust, but compact, subdued, more like the breath of someone whispering than the roar of a bonfire. Spectroscopic instruments, those that separate light into its fingerprints of chemical elements, struggled to read it. The usual signatures of water vapour and carbon compounds, the expected molecules that betray a comet's icy core, were faint and hesitant. One telescope reported a hint, another saw nothing, and all agreed that the emissions were far weaker than they should have been. It was as if Atlas were deliberately holding back, revealing just enough to qualify as a comet but no more. Some scientists suggested exotic chemistry, perhaps ices formed in regions colder than anything near our sun, or surface layers baked inert by eons of cosmic radiation. Others allowed themselves to wonder whether the restraint was intentional, a mask to avoid detection. Public interest bloomed quickly. By mid-July, amateur astronomers were pointing their backyard instruments towards Sagittarius, hoping to glimpse the visitor. Images appeared on forums, sometimes grainy, sometimes beautiful, each a tiny smear of light against crowded starfields. The story spread beyond the cloisters of academia into late-night talk shows, science podcasts, even speculative fiction communities. It resonated because it arrived at a moment when the world was unusually receptive to the idea of other intelligences. Government hearings had aired on unexplained aerial phenomena. Scientific journals had begun publishing papers on technosignatures, clues not of biology, but of technology. The cultural ground was fertile for questions that might once have been dismissed, and into that openness stepped Atlas, with its improbable course and coy behaviour, like a riddle written across the heavens. One of the loudest voices belonged to Avi Loeb, a Harvard astronomer known both for his brilliance and his controversial willingness to consider extraordinary explanations. Years earlier he had suggested that Oumuamua might have been artificial, perhaps a fragment of light sail drifting between stars. His colleagues had pushed back, insisting on natural causes, yet his argument had found a large audience precisely because he refused to shut the door on possibilities. With Atlas, Loeb spoke again, proposing that we should at least entertain the idea of reconnaissance. Suppose, he said, that an advanced civilization wished to study us discreetly. What better disguise than to cloak a probe in the appearance of a comet? What better route than one that passed close to planets worth observing? Mars with its history of water, Venus with its thick veil of atmosphere, Jupiter with its gravitational majesty, and Earth itself, of course, alive with oceans, cities, and signals that leak into the void. The suggestion was not a declaration, but a challenge, that science should not shy away from hypotheses simply because they seem extraordinary. The object's timing added to the sense of strangeness. Its closest swing by the sun, its perihelion, would occur in late October, precisely when it would be hidden behind the solar disk from our perspective. The very moment when solar heating should reveal the most about its interior chemistry would be the moment we could not observe it. Ground-based telescopes would be blinded, even many space instruments unable to peer through the glare. For weeks, Atlas would slip behind the curtain of the sun, unseen, free to act in ways that might never be recorded. Natural coincidence, perhaps, or convenient cover. By the end of that summer, the narrative had grown larger than the data. Atlas had become a mirror in which humanity saw its own hopes and fears reflected. For some, it was a scientific opportunity, a chance to sample matter from beyond our local neighbourhood, carrying isotopes from stars that burned long before ours was born. For others, It was a test case, a thought experiment in how we might recognize technology when it chooses to resemble nature. And for many who simply watch the sky, it was a reminder of how small we are, that a visitor can appear without warning, travel a path no one expected, and vanish again into the dark. In its ambiguity, Atlas held power, too comet-like to dismiss as engineered, too strange to rest easy in the category of the ordinary. It hovered between worlds of explanation, forcing us to live with the uncertainty, to acknowledge how little we truly know about the traffic of objects moving silently across interstellar space. The days after the discovery unfolded like ripples spreading outward from a pebble cast into still water. At first, only astronomers spoke of Three-Eye Atlas in quiet tones, trading data tables and orbital predictions, their language wrapped in the mathematics of celestial mechanics. But soon the story broke into wider currents, carried by science journalists who understood how to turn figures and probabilities into images that stirred the imagination. They spoke of an interstellar messenger, a wanderer from beyond our sun, a body older than Earth itself that now skimmed so close to our planets it seemed almost purposeful. In coffee shops, people read the headlines and asked each other whether we were being watched. In classrooms, teachers pulled up simulations of its path and let their students marvel at the thin line that traced its journey, curving improbably through the inner solar system. The object had been travelling unseen for millions of years, yet the moment of recognition belonged to us, here and now. That timing alone felt uncanny, as if the cosmos had chosen to reveal a secret at precisely the moment when humanity was ready to ask what it might mean. Scientists tried to keep the language grounded. They described a hyperbolic trajectory, meaning one not bound to the gravity of our sun, a mathematical curve that promised the visitor would never return. They compared it to its predecessors, reminding the public that such objects were expected, even inevitable, given the number of star systems that populate our galaxy. Yet every explanation seemed to carry a shadow of doubt, a sense that this one was different. Its path grazed 3 planets in ways that did not fit the expected randomness. Its brightness flickered in patterns that could be interpreted as surface irregularities, but could also, if one allowed imagination a foothold, resemble controlled activity. And above all, its comet-like emissions remained stubbornly subdued, as though the object were rehearsing the role of a natural body without fully committing to the performance. Among those who followed the story, there was a sense of déjà vu. Memories of Oumuamua lingered, the elongated shard that had tumbled through in 2017, too thin and too reflective, accelerating in ways no one could explain. At the time, many had dismissed the debate as sensationalism, but Atlas arrived into a world that had shifted. Reports of unidentified aerial phenomena were no longer taboo topics locked away in conspiracy circles. Congressional hearings in the United States had aired videos of objects moving with unexplained acceleration, their authenticity confirmed by military officials. Scientists had begun speaking openly about technosignatures, evidence of technology rather than biology, as legitimate targets for research. The cultural mood had tilted from dismissal to curiosity, and so when Avi Loeb once again suggested that perhaps we were not looking at a mere comet, more people listened, not because they accepted the claim outright, but because the idea no longer seemed impossible. Loeb's framing was careful. He did not declare Atlas to be artificial. Instead, he invited colleagues to treat the possibilities seriously, to design observational tests that could distinguish between natural and technological origins. This shift in tone mattered. The scientific method thrives on hypotheses tested against evidence, not on pronouncements of certainty. By proposing reconnaissance as one working theory among several, Loeb gave permission for others to ask questions without fear of ridicule. What if the object was indeed a probe disguised as stone and ice? What kind of data could it gather while sweeping past Mars, Venus, and Jupiter? What transmissions might it send during the weeks when it slipped behind the sun, hidden from earthly view? What signs should astronomers look for if they wish to catch a glimpse of design in the guise of geology? Meanwhile, the public began to craft its own narratives. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Some imagined ancient civilizations seeding probes like spores across the galaxy, drifting silently until they found worlds worth examining. Others invoked the dark forest theory, a haunting idea drawn from modern science fiction, which proposed that civilizations remain hidden out of fear, watching each other like hunters in a forest where to reveal oneself is to risk destruction. In such a universe, a disguised probe would be the safest way to observe. The fact that Atlas remained ambiguous, never fully natural, never fully alien, seemed to reinforce the theory. Perhaps it was meant to be undecidable, a puzzle designed to test whether we were capable of recognizing intelligence that refused to announce itself. The tension between science and imagination grew sharper as more telescopes were trained on the visitor. The Hubble Space Telescope captured images that showed a compact coma but no dramatic tail. The James Webb Space Telescope prepared to analyze its chemistry in infrared wavelengths, seeking signatures of ices and organics that might reveal its birthplace. Amateur astronomers coordinated through online groups, sharing raw data and stacking images to trace its movement across the constellations. For a brief season, the entire planet seemed united by the act of watching a faint point of light glide silently through space. That collective gaze carried something almost spiritual, as if humanity had stumbled upon a cosmic mirror and was waiting to see its own reflection. Yet beneath the wonder lay unease. What if the visitor was more than it appeared? Some asked whether it might change course unexpectedly, a maneuver that would shatter the illusion of chance. Others feared what it might transmit while hidden behind the sun. A few even speculated, half in jest and half in dread, that it could release smaller probes, unseen, to linger in our planetary neighbourhood. These ideas were not supported by evidence, but the absence of certainty allowed imagination to fill the void. Every silence in the data became a canvas for projection. At universities, students debated late into the night, toggling between excitement and skepticism. Some argued that humanity was desperate to find the meaning in the unknown, projecting agency onto random events. Others countered that history showed the danger of dismissing anomalies too quickly. After all, for centuries people had explained falling rocks as myths, until the science of meteorites proved otherwise. Perhaps, they suggested, the line between natural and artificial was thinner than we thought, especially when dealing with technologies that might be millions of years beyond our own. What would artificial even look like at that scale? A probe could be engineered to mimic geology so perfectly that only its improbable trajectory betrayed its origin. The object itself remained silent. It neither confirmed nor denied the stories spun around it. It drifted according to the mathematics of orbital mechanics, a curve written in the language of gravity and motion, and yet that curve intersected our imagination at every point. We watched, we speculated, we debated, but above all we wondered. In its ambiguity, Atlas taught us something about ourselves. How quickly we reach for narratives, how eager we are to place mystery within the frameworks of myth, science, or conspiracy. It revealed our hunger to know whether we are alone, and our discomfort when the answer remains just out of reach. As summer deepened and the nights grew shorter, the anticipation built. Observers knew that the object would soon pass close to Mars, offering spacecraft orbiting the red planet a chance to capture images at higher resolution than Earth-bound telescopes could manage. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, with its sharp-eyed high-rise camera, was scheduled to attempt photographs. Scientists spoke cautiously about what might be seen: variations in brightness, perhaps hints of surface structure. But the public latched onto the idea that this would be the moment of revelation, the close-up that could settle the debate. Would it show a rugged rock pocked with craters, or something smoother, more regular, more unsettlingly geometric? No one could say. The uncertainty sharpened the sense of living on the edge of a story too large to predict. Through it all, Atlas remained nothing more than a dim speck of light, visible only through instruments, drifting at a distance so great that even its close approach to Mars would span millions of kilometres. Yet the meaning we attached to that speck grew larger than the object itself. It became a vessel into which humanity poured its anxieties, its dreams, its readiness or unreadiness for contact. In that sense, the comet, or probe, or whatever it might be, was not only a traveller from the stars, but also a reflection of our species, showing us the stories we tell when faced with the unknown. As the weeks passed, the anticipation surrounding Atlas thickened like the hush before a storm. The public conversation, once a ripple of curiosity, had swelled into a tide that seemed to wash across every corner of cultural life. News anchors who rarely spoke of orbital mechanics began gesturing at animated graphics, explaining perihelion with the confidence of storytellers. Documentaries sprang up on streaming platforms, their trailers whispering of the mysterious visitor beyond the stars. Social media fed on the ambiguity, weaving countless theories, some careful and reasoned, others tinged with wild imaginings. All the while, astronomers returned night after night to their instruments, carefully logging coordinates, refining trajectories, watching a speck of light that never betrayed more than it wished. It was as though the object itself enjoyed playing the role of cosmic enigma, giving away fragments of data that always raise more questions than they resolved. Mars loomed large in these discussions, not because the red planet held any sway over the object's path, but because the geometry of its journey offered a tantalizing chance. Atlas would pass within tens of millions of kilometers, astronomically close when compared to the usual remoteness of interstellar wanderers. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, already circling the planet with its powerful high-rise camera, became the focus of hope. That camera had previously photographed craters no wider than a classroom, and even spotted rovers as tiny moving dots on the Martian desert. If it could resolve such detail from orbit, perhaps it could capture something meaningful of Atlas as it swept by. Yet even here, expectations had to be tempered. The distances remained enormous, the time windows narrow, and the object's motion rapid. What could be caught in such conditions might be little more than a grainy point surrounded by a haze of dust. But to many, even a grainy point felt like the promise of revelation. The scientific community worked with quiet urgency. Teams across the world coordinated observation schedules, each telescope adding another stitch to the growing fabric of data. Spectrographs continued to strain against faint emissions, occasionally pulling out whispers of carbon dioxide, hints of organic molecules, weak glimmers of water vapour. None of these results fit neatly into expectation. The ratios were skewed, the signatures erratic, as if the object carried chemistry unlike anything in our catalogue of comets. Theories sprang up to explain the anomalies. Perhaps Atlas was forged around an ancient star poor in heavy elements, making its ices different from those in our system. Perhaps cosmic rays had sculpted its surface into a crust that throttled the escape of gases. Each explanation made sense in fragments, yet none seemed to settle the picture. The object remained a puzzle box, one that refused to open cleanly. As word of these anomalies spread, a different kind of interest stirred beyond the labs and observatories. Government agencies, rarely quick to comment on astronomical curiosities, began to show subtle signs of attention. Meetings were scheduled, though the details stayed quiet. Leaked documents suggested that space agencies were considering whether Atlas posed any navigational hazard, though such concerns seemed largely unnecessary given its path. Others speculated that the military might be curious about signals, if the object transmitted, if it responded to radio, if it revealed more than light and dust. Of course, no public evidence supported such claims, yet the very silence was enough to feed speculation. In a world where secrecy was common, the absence of information felt like confirmation to those eager for conspiracies. Thus Atlas became not just a celestial body, but a character in a story of intrigue, a mirror for humanity's suspicion of its own institutions. The weeks leading to the Mars encounter were filled with a peculiar mix of rigour and wonder. On one hand, the daily grind of data analysis continued. Pixels measured, brightness curves plotted, orbit models refined. On the other, conversations drifted into philosophy. If this were a probe, some asked, what might it be looking for? Would it study atmospheres and geology, or something more intangible, the ways in which a civilization reacts to the unknown? Others wondered whether it might even be indifferent to us, a relic launched millennia ago, now drifting without purpose, its creators long gone. That idea carried a quiet melancholy, a machine older than our species, wandering not as a spy but as a tombstone for a vanished culture. Such thoughts blurred the line between science and myth, yet they carried their own kind of truth, reminding us how discovery always tugs at the heart as much as the mind. The public's fascination took many forms. Amateur astronomers gathered for atlas parties, pointing small telescopes at the night sky while explaining to children what they were seeing. Artists painted visions of the visitor as a crystalline shard, a silver spindle, a glowing ember. Writers filled blogs with fictional dispatches, imagining Atlas as a silent observer sending home reports on our noisy blue planet. Even musicians found inspiration, composing ambient tracks layered with cosmic hums, offering listeners the sense of drifting alongside the interstellar wanderer. The object, indifferent to all of this, continued on its path, but in doing so it bound together communities of people who might otherwise never have spoken to one another. In its silence it created dialogue. And always, at the centre of the discourse hovered that tantalizing ambiguity. Every new image seemed to prove it was a comet, the faint halo of dust, the spectral hints of volatile gases. Yet every detail also contained an anomaly. The coma too compact, the ratios of molecules too strange, the trajectory too precise. It was as if Atlas occupied a liminal zone, refusing to be fully natural or fully artificial. For some, this was evidence of design. Who better than an advanced intelligence to craft a disguise that sits perfectly between categories? For others, it was simply the mark of how little we understand about interstellar chemistry and dynamics. After all, we'd observed only 3 such objects in all of history. How could we expect them to conform neatly to our limited expectations? As August gave way to September, the sense of urgency grew sharper. Time was running short. Soon Atlas would slip behind the sun, entering a period when it would be hidden from direct observation for weeks. That invisibility loomed like a cliff in the timeline, a moment when the story might branch into darkness. If it were a natural comet, we would lose nothing but data. If it were something more, we might miss the only chance to witness its secrets. This knowledge lent every night's observation a heightened weight, as if each photon gathered by telescope lenses was a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass. Astronomers worked late. Students pored over code. Data centers hummed with the task of analysis. The visitor remained impassive, continuing its journey, indifferent to the deadlines of human curiosity. The world watched together, and yet each viewer projected something different onto the silent traveller. To a child gazing through a backyard telescope, it was a spark of adventure. To a scientist, it was a riddle framed in equations and spectra. To a dreamer, it was perhaps the first sign that we were not alone. The truth, hidden within the object's nucleus, remained unreachable. But in a way, the mystery was its gift. For a few brief months, humanity shared the wonder of not knowing, of standing together beneath the stars, eyes turned upward, waiting to see what secrets the sky might yield. Atlas, where the comet or construct had already changed us, reminding us that the unknown is never merely an absence of information, but a space where imagination and discovery meet. The night of the Mars flyby arrived like a long-awaited performance, the kind that draws both scientists and dreamers into the same hushed anticipation. Across the globe, observatories and living rooms alike turned their attention toward the red planet, not because Mars itself was the focus, but because it had become the perfect vantage point for watching Atlas sweep by. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter had been programmed weeks in advance, its high-rise camera pointed with mathematical precision toward the patch of sky where the object was predicted to appear. Engineers spoke of the timing as if it were choreography. The orbiting spacecraft would have only a narrow window, a matter of hours to glimpse the visitor as it passed millions of kilometers away. Yet in those few hours, humanity's hopes for clarity seemed to converge. Would the images at last reveal whether this was merely another fragment of ice and stone, or something crafted with intention? When the first data packets began to trickle back to Earth, the atmosphere was electric. Screens lit up in control rooms as pixelated previews appeared. At first there was only noise, random specks of brightness against a field of black. But slowly, through processing and alignment, a faint dot emerged, encircled by a subtle halo of dust and gas. Scientists leaned forward, eyes straining for detail. As the images resolved further, shapes suggested themselves. Perhaps an irregular surface, maybe a variation in brightness hinting at topography. Some whispered of geometric impressions, a hint of symmetry that could mean either a trick of resolution or something else entirely. The truth lay in the uncertain space between perception and proof. Even at its closest, Atlas remained stubbornly remote, never more than a glimmer magnified by lenses and software. Yet that glimmer carried the weight of a mystery that no one could set down. The official release of the images a few days later set off another wave of fascination. Newspapers splashed them across front pages, describing the object as comet-like yet peculiar. Scientific reports noted that the coma appeared unusually spherical, lacking the elongated tail most comets develop under solar pressure. The surface brightness seemed oddly stable, as if the object rotated more slowly than expected for something of its size. To the cautious observer, these were simply anomalies in need of better models. To the curious public, they were signs, clues that perhaps the visitor was not simply a natural wanderer. Social media divided into camps, each armed with interpretations, one side insisting the images confirmed a comet, the other seeing in the smudged patterns the silhouette of design. Both sides were fueled by the same blurry evidence, reminding us how much of belief is shaped not by data itself, but by the stories we weave around it. What struck many scientists most was the regularity of Atlas's brightness variations. Comets, especially those with irregular shapes, usually tumble, creating chaotic light curves as different faces reflect the sun. But Atlas's changes were oddly consistent, as if it rotated with deliberate rhythm. The period of rotation was slower than anticipated, and the transitions between brighter and dimmer phases followed patterns that suggested more than random geometry. Some proposed that the body might simply be more spherical than typical comets, smoothing out its variations. Others wondered aloud whether internal structure, dense cores, layered shells, might account for the stability. Yet beneath these explanations lingered the unsettling possibility that the steadiness was intentional, a way to optimize observation, like a probe turning slowly to survey its surroundings with patience rather than haste. For the general public, the Mars encounter became a kind of cosmic theatre. News outlets hosted roundtables where astrophysicists debated with philosophers and science fiction authors. One writer compared Atlas to an ancient mariner's lantern, drifting past our planetary shores with steady light, a reminder that the universe is not empty, but populated with messengers whose languages we may not yet know. Another speaker invoked the cargo cult metaphor from anthropology. Just as isolated tribes once interpreted planes and ships as divine, perhaps we were seeing technology so advanced it masqueraded as nature. The metaphor carried both humility and warning. How easily we might misread signs, mistaking the extraordinary for the ordinary, or the ordinary for the extraordinary, depending on the frame we choose. At universities, students packed lecture halls to hear updates, even though most of what could be said was that the object remained enigmatic. Professors found themselves weaving orbital dynamics with reflections on human curiosity. They reminded their audiences that ambiguity is not failure but part of discovery, that the unknown often resists neat classification. Yet even they admitted the peculiar convergence of factors was difficult to ignore. The trajectory that brushed past multiple planets, the restrained outgassing, the timing of the solar eclipse just as perihelion approached, all of these created a pattern too suggestive to dismiss easily. It was as though the cosmos had presented humanity with a riddle precisely calibrated to remain unsolved, a story balanced on the knife edge between science and myth. Meanwhile, citizen scientists contributed with enthusiasm. Retired engineers ran their own orbital simulations, posting charts that showed how improbable the path truly was. Amateur astronomers stitched together images from backyard telescopes, comparing them with official releases, arguing over faint streaks and shadows. Some created elaborate visualizations, portraying Atlas as a glowing pearl threading its way between planetary orbits. These contributions, though not always precise, added texture to the unfolding drama. For the first time, a celestial event of such subtlety was being followed in real time, not just by institutions, but by a global community of ordinary people. In living rooms, cafes, and classrooms, conversations turned toward the visitor, and for a moment the mysteries of the universe felt less remote, more like a shared secret whispered into countless ears. Yet as September advanced, the story took on a darker edge. Astronomers reminded the public that Atlas was about to slip behind the sun, entering a period of invisibility that might last weeks. For scientists, this was frustrating. The moment of greatest solar heating, when comets usually reveal their innermost materials, would occur precisely when observation was impossible. For theorists of the extraordinary, it was uncanny, even suspicious. What better cover for concealed activity than the blinding glare of our star? Conjectures flourished, that Atlas might deploy smaller craft during the eclipse, that it might alter its course unseen, that it might even transmit signals using the sun as a shield. None of these ideas were testable, yet their very untestability fed the sense of intrigue. In the absence of data, imagination becomes sovereign, and imagination is rarely modest. Scientists, for their part, worked to frame the coming eclipse as an opportunity as well as a loss. Spacecraft like the Parker Solar Probe, orbiting closer to the Sun than any mission before, might be able to catch indirect signatures, even if not designed for such tasks. Plans were drawn, contingencies prepared, though expectations remained cautious. The reality was that Atlas would soon pass beyond our gaze, leaving us with nothing but inference and speculation until it re-emerged on the far side of the sun. The gap in observation became a symbolic horizon, a curtain drawn across the stage of the cosmos. What occurred behind it would remain forever ambiguous, a mystery sealed by the very mechanics of our solar system. As the final visible nights approached, telescopes around the world turned eagerly toward the fading object. Images showed the coma growing more pronounced, structures developing within the haze as different ices sublimated. Spectra revealed new molecules, traces of hydrogen sulfide, hints of rare organics, adding to the chemical puzzle. Each discovery raised questions. Why were some compounds appearing at temperatures where they should have remained frozen? Why did others remain stable against expectation? The anomalies piled higher, each one a brick in a wall that neither confirmed nor denied the extraordinary. The visitor remained committed to ambiguity, a master of withholding. In living rooms and observatories alike, people felt the weight of that ambiguity. There was excitement, yes, but also a subtle melancholy. The Mars flyby had not delivered clarity. Instead, it had deepened the mystery, showing us just enough to remind us how little we knew. And now, just as the story grew richest, the curtain of the sun was about to fall. Atlas, the interstellar wanderer, the possible probe, the cosmic riddle, would vanish from our sight. What it did in that hidden space would be written into speculation, not science. Humanity, with all its instruments and imaginations, would be left waiting, eyes fixed on the horizon of the sky, wondering what truths might slip through the veil of light when the traveller emerged once more. When Atlas finally slipped behind the sun, the sky seemed to exhale, as though a curtain had drawn across a play just as the plot reached its most tantalizing moment. To the unaided eye, nothing changed. The stars still wheeled overhead, the planets still traced their slow arcs. But for those who had been following the object's passage, its sudden absence was like the vanishing of a character mid-sentence, leaving silence where revelation was expected. The weeks ahead would be filled not with data but with waiting, a liminal stretch of time where imagination was free to wander in the absence of light. Astronomers consoled themselves with calculations, running models of how solar heating should cause the visitor to behave, predicting brightness increases and volatile releases. Yet each prediction carried the unspoken caveat. None of it could be confirmed until the object reappeared. In the gap, speculation bloomed like vines reaching for sunlight. Some of the most sober scientists admitted frustration. The perihelion passage of any comet is the moment of greatest interest, when ice boils away to expose interior layers untouched since formation. For an interstellar visitor, this chance was priceless. Chemical signatures written billions of years ago could have surfaced, revealing something of the environment in which Atlas had been born. Instead, the most vital clues were swallowed by the sun's glare, hidden beyond reach. It was a cosmic irony. At the very instant when the object should have spoken most clearly, it disappeared into silence. Yet for others, especially those inclined toward the extraordinary, the timing seemed almost too neat. Was it coincidence? Or was it convenience? Theories multiplied with the rapidity of rumour. Online forums speculated that the object might be conducting operations during its invisibility, deploying smaller craft to linger undetected in the inner solar system. Some imagined it unfolding instruments, scanning our planets with eyes more advanced than we could fathom. Others suggested it might be transmitting, using the sun itself as cover to mask signals beamed toward distant stars. These scenarios were unprovable, and yet they thrived precisely because of their unprovability. The blankness of observation created a fertile ground where imagination could seed endless possibilities. People posted sketches of what such activities might look like. Small, geometric shapes peeling away from the nucleus, hidden maneuvers unfolding in the halo of solar fire. Whether fanciful or not, they spoke to a deeper truth, that humanity, when confronted with the unknown, fills silence with story. Meanwhile, agencies debated how best to make use of the limited instruments that could operate near the sun. The Parker Solar Probe, hurtling through the inner corona at breathtaking speed, offered a faint hope. Though designed to study solar wind and magnetic fields, its instruments might, if aligned just right, catch some whisper of the passing visitor. Engineers weighed the risks of adjusting the probe's pointing, aware that its delicate instruments were shielded only narrowly against the sun's fury. In conference rooms, scenarios were sketched and erased, decisions deferred until the probabilities could be better assessed. For most scientists, the likelihood of Parker glimpsing Atlas was slim, but even slim chances were pursued, for the value of any data was beyond calculation. The idea that one of humanity's fastest machines might, by luck or planning, share a corridor of space with the interstellar traveller carried a poetry too irresistible to ignore. For the public, however, the absence became a kind of theatre in itself. News outlets ran features not on what was known, but on what could not be seen. Animated graphics showed Atlas slipping behind the sun as if into a chamber of secrecy. Commentators spoke of a cosmic intermission, a pause in the play of observation. Social media thrummed with countdowns, people marking the days until Reemergence. In classrooms, teachers used the moment to speak of patience in science. how knowledge often requires waiting through long stretches of silence before answers appear. Yet even as patience was preached, excitement smouldered. What if, some asked, the object returned altered? What if its brightness surged beyond expectation, or its path shifted, or its emissions changed in ways unaccountable by nature? These what-ifs fueled late-night conversations, turning the invisible passage into an event as dramatic as any visible spectacle. Philosophers joined the discourse, treating the hidden perihelion as a metaphor. They compared it to the ancient practice of initiation rites, where knowledge was withheld until the candidate endured a period of darkness. In myths, heroes often entered underworlds or caves before returning transformed. Atlas, they suggested, had entered such a realm, and its return would mark a revelation, though of what kind no one could say. The symbolism caught on, spreading through essays and opinion pieces, reminding people that mystery itself can be a teacher. The visitor was forcing us to confront not only the limits of our instruments, but the limits of our certainty. In that uncertainty, they argued, lay an invitation to imagine, to reflect, to acknowledge the vastness of what we do not know. Still, the work of science continued in the background, steady and unsentimental. Data collected before the eclipse was pored over with meticulous care. Analysts searched for faint periodicities in brightness, for subtle shifts in the coma that might hint at rotation or internal structure. Spectra were re-examined for overlooked signals, with some researchers claiming to see unusual ratios of isotopes, though consensus remained elusive. Papers were drafted, cautious in tone, repeating the mantra that more data would be needed after Reemergence. Yet between the lines, one could read the hunger, the sense that this object had already exceeded expectations by refusing to fit neatly into any category. Whether natural or artificial, it was extraordinary simply by virtue of its strangeness. Beyond the professional sphere, ordinary people responded in ways both whimsical and profound. Artists painted the eclipse as a drama, depicting Atlas slipping into a sea of fire, its silhouette ringed by solar light. Poets wrote of a messenger cloaked in brilliance, hiding its true words until the right moment. Musicians released tracks of ambient soundscapes meant to accompany the invisible journey, compositions filled with slow crescendos and sudden silences. Communities hosted watch parties, not to watch the object, it was unseen, but to mark the passage, to share the act of waiting. In a curious way, the absence united people as much as the presence had. They shared the same ignorance, the same anticipation, the same questions echoing in the dark. Among the most poignant reflections came from those who remembered earlier mysteries. Older astronomers recalled the 1977 "Wow" signal, a brief radio burst from space that had never been explained. Others invoked the Voyager probes, now drifting at the edge of interstellar space, carrying golden records engraved with sounds of Earth. What if some other civilization had done the same, launching Atlas as a messenger long before our species learned to write? The thought was speculative, perhaps fanciful, yet it resonated because it underscored the symmetry of curiosity. Just as we long to send our voices outward, perhaps others do as well. In that symmetry lay a sense of kinship, however distant. The hidden weeks dragged on, stretching patience. Each day astronomers checked models, refining the expected point of Reemergence. Each day the object remained cloaked. The sun, indifferent, burned and flared, its storms sweeping past spacecraft, its light overwhelming every attempt to peer through. The calendar inched forward, and with it, anticipation tightened like a bowstring. Soon, they said, it will appear again. Soon the sky will return what it has hidden. Yet beneath the hope, there was a quieter knowledge. Even when it re-emerged, the ambiguity might remain. The visitor might reveal more, or it might remain as silent as ever, a riddle written in ice and dust. But even silence has meaning. It reminds us that the universe owes us no explanations, that sometimes the greatest gift is not the answer, but the question itself. So the world waited. Instruments were primed, telescopes calibrated, minds sharpened to catch the first glimmer of light. Somewhere beyond the solar blaze, Atlas moved unseen, its path steady, its secrets intact. Whether comet or construct, relic or reconnaissance, it carried with it the weight of our collective wonder. In that wonder, humanity found itself once more bound together, not by certainty, but by the shared act of looking up, waiting for the sky to speak again. The first reports of Atlas's return came not from a major observatory, but from a modest station in southern Spain, where an amateur astronomer named Luis Ortega had been tracking the predicted coordinates with almost religious devotion. On a cool October night he posted a grainy image on an online forum, a faint smear of light against the black velvet of the sky. "It's back," he wrote simply, and though the photograph revealed little more than a pale blur, the words carried across communities of watchers like a flare in the dark. Within hours, larger telescopes confirmed it. Atlas had emerged from behind the solar curtain, alive with activity brighter than when it had vanished. The intermission was over. The next act of the drama had begun. Astronomers scrambled to reorient their instruments. The James Webb Space Telescope was one of the first to respond, its infrared eyes capable of peeling away the veil of dust to read the heat and chemistry within. When its data arrived, it painted a portrait that only deepened the enigma. The spectra showed not just the usual fingerprints of water and carbon dioxide, but an unexpected cocktail of exotic compounds, hydrogen, cyanide in concentrations higher than predicted, faint traces of acetylene, and even whispers of complex organics that should not have survived in such a volatile environment. Some of these molecules are known precursors to life, sparking headlines that spoke of seeds of biology drifting from the stars. Scientists urged caution, reminding the public that chemistry is not destiny, that organics can form in cold interstellar clouds without ever giving rise to life. Yet the symbolism was irresistible. Here was a traveller bearing the same raw ingredients from which our own biology had once been stirred. The brightness curves revealed more surprises. Rather than fading steadily after perihelion, as most comets do, Atlas's light output fluctuated in pulses. Every few days its coma would intensify, swelling as if from controlled bursts of gas, then recede again. Some astronomers suggested that the pulses reflected pockets of ice being exposed in sequence, the natural rhythm of a body rotating unevenly. Others noted the regularity of the intervals, the way the flares seemed too disciplined to be random. Once again, the object sat astride the line between natural explanation and something more deliberate. Was it breathing in cycles or signalling in code? Meanwhile, ground-based telescopes captured images of the coma that seemed unusually symmetrical. Instead of the ragged, uneven plumes typical of comets, Atlas displayed a halo that often appeared unnaturally uniform, as if sculpted. Observers debated whether this symmetry was an artifact of perspective or evidence of something more. A few even speculated that the gas was being released through vents, like nozzles arranged to maintain balance, rather than haphazard fractures in ice. To skeptics, such claims were merely imagination stretched over blurry pixels. To others, they hinted at design hiding in plain sight. The return of Atlas ignited fresh waves of public fascination. News outlets revived the story with renewed vigour, framing it as a mystery that had refused to die. Documentaries rushed to update their scripts. Journalists requested interviews with astronomers, and podcasts filled with conversations about what the new data might mean. For a public already steeped in discussions of unidentified aerial phenomena and the possibility of alien intelligence, the timing felt uncanny. The narrative of a disguised probe gained momentum, fueled not by proof but by the refusal of the object to conform to expectation. Each anomaly was a spark that lit the tinder of speculation. Among scientists, the debate grew sharper. At conferences, presentations on Atlas overflowed with attendees. Some argued passionately for caution, warning that premature leaps to extraordinary conclusions could erode credibility. Others countered that refusing to consider the artificial was itself unscientific, a form of bias that blinded us to possibilities. The discussions often turned philosophical. What does it mean to call something natural or artificial when our sample size of interstellar objects was so small? Could advanced technology look indistinguishable from geology? If so, how could we ever know? These questions left the room buzzing long after the projectors dimmed. Culturally, Atlas became a symbol of the threshold between known and unknown. Artists portrayed it as a glowing orb carried on invisible currents, a lantern adrift in cosmic waters. Musicians composed scores that pulsed in rhythm with its brightness cycles, suggesting messages encoded in the silence of space. Writers penned speculative stories in which Atlas was a scout, or a relic, or even a form of life that had chosen the disguise of a comet. Each creative response refracted the mystery through a different lens, but all shared a common theme, the sense that the universe was speaking to us, if only in whispers. Ordinary people, too, found ways to participate. Amateur astronomers across the world coordinated online, pooling their observations into collective databases. Students stayed up late to track its movement, writing essays not only about the object, but about the feeling of waiting for it to reappear. Families gathered in backyards, pointing small telescopes toward the patch of sky, where the visitor glowed faintly, passing binoculars from hand to hand. In the act of watching, they felt connected not only to the mystery but to each other, as if Atlas had stitched a thread across continents, weaving a fabric of shared curiosity. For governments and agencies, the renewed visibility of Atlas posed questions beyond the scientific. If there were even a chance it was artificial, should it be treated as a matter of security? Quiet inquiries were rumoured within defence circles, though officials offered no public comment. Satellites monitored the visitor, not because it posed a direct threat, it was far too distant for that, but because it represented an unknown, in a domain where the unknown had always commanded attention. Leaks suggested that agencies had tasked instruments not normally devoted to astronomy to record the object, searching for radio signals, electromagnetic pulses, or anomalies in motion. Nothing conclusive emerged, but the very act of looking revealed the seriousness with which the possibility was entertained. Philosophers, theologians, and cultural critics continued to mine the story for meaning. Some spoke of Atlas as a mirror, reflecting our longing for contact, our fear of isolation, our tendency to project agency onto the silent. Others framed it as a parable, that truth often hides in ambiguity, refusing to be captured by categories. Religious thinkers compared it to angels in ancient texts, messengers that appeared briefly, spoke in riddles, and departed, leaving humans to wrestle with interpretation. In every tradition, the visitor found resonance, as if each world view recognized something familiar in its refusal to be explained. Through it all, Atlas remained what it had always been, a faint point of light, crossing the sky with steady motion, wrapped in a halo of dust. It offered no messages, no gestures of intent, only data that could be bent toward countless narratives. And yet, that very silence was powerful. It invited us to confront the limits of our knowing, to sit with mystery without rushing to resolution. In its reemergence, it reminded us that the universe is not obliged to answer our questions, and that perhaps the act of asking, of looking, of wondering is itself the point. As October turned to November, telescopes continued their vigil. Atlas would not linger long. Its hyperbolic path guaranteed it would soon speed outward, slipping once again into the dark between stars. But for now, it was with us, a companion in our skies, pulling humanity's gaze upward. Whether comet or construct, relic or riddle, it had already reshaped our imagination. Its journey through the solar system would be brief, but the stories it stirred, the questions it provoked, would endure far longer. For in the end, the gift of Atlas was not an answer, but a reminder that in the vast silence of the cosmos, even a single spark of uncertainty is enough to set our world alight with wonder. By the time November arrived, Atlas had become less a comet and more a cultural phenomenon, a canvas onto which the world projected its collective dreams and doubts. It hung in the sky, faint and stubbornly distant, yet on Earth its presence grew vivid, infiltrating conversations across cafes, classrooms, temples, and digital feeds. The ambiguity of its nature, too ordered to be entirely natural, too chaotic to be confidently artificial, was precisely what gave it power. People do not gather around certainties, they gather around mysteries. An Atlas, with its shimmering silence, had become a mystery large enough to unite millions, even if only for a brief moment in history. In New Delhi, a group of students organised what they called cosmic vigils, gathering on rooftops at night to sit in circles, drink chai, and point laser pointers at the general region of the sky where Atlas glowed invisibly to the naked eye. They read poetry about distance and longing, and one student recited lines from the Rig Veda about wanderers in the sky who carry the fire of knowledge. To them, Atlas was not just a rock. It was a reminder that humanity itself was a wanderer, restless and searching. Across the Atlantic in Brazil, a samba troupe painted their drums with comet tails, rehearsing under banners that proclaimed Mensajero das Estrelas, messenger of the stars. Their rehearsals spilled into the streets, transforming the visitor into rhythm and dance. Religious communities also found language to describe the enigma. In Catholic sermons, priests compared Atlas to the Mag's star, a light from afar drawing attention to truths not yet revealed. In mosques, imams spoke of signs in the heavens, verses of the Quran that describe stars as both beauty and guidance. Some evangelical circles in the United States wove it into apocalyptic narratives, warning that a harbinger had appeared and that humanity should prepare for judgment. Others, in Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, offered a calmer reading. Atlas was a reminder of impermanence, a fleeting guest reminding us that even cosmic travellers eventually pass away into silence. Each tradition bent the light of Atlas through its own prism, finding meaning in the unknown. Governments, more cautious, wrestled with their own responses. Intelligence agencies had quietly intensified monitoring of radio frequencies, hoping to catch any anomaly that might betray intentional transmission. Nothing conclusive surfaced, though reports leaked of faint periodic bursts, likely natural, but curiously aligned with the brightness pulses already noted by telescopes. The official statements remained careful. No evidence of artificiality has been found. But the absence of certainty was interpreted by the public in the opposite way. If nothing had been found, surely something was being hidden. The secrecy that often surrounds military and intelligence work, ironically, fueled belief that Atlas was more than rock and ice, and so the mystery tightened its grip. In art galleries, exhibitions sprang up with astonishing speed. Painters depicted Atlas as a glowing seed carried across cosmic winds. Sculptors shaped abstract forms of spirals and fragments, installing them in plazas where children climbed and played, as though the enigma were already a part of everyday life. A Japanese photographer staged long exposure portraits of people standing beneath the sky, their blurred outlines meant to echo the indistinct form of the comet itself. Even commercial industries found ways to participate. Clothing brands printed comet symbols on jackets, musicians released albums titled After the Visitor, and advertisers slipped the imagery of a glowing halo into campaigns for everything from cars to coffee. In less than 6 months, Atlas had entered the global lexicon, transformed from a catalogue entry into a cultural myth. Yet amid the celebration lay unease. Fears began to circulate, whispered in forums and late-night radio programs. Some warned that Atlas's path might change unexpectedly, that it could pose a threat of collision. Astrophysicists dismissed the idea. The orbit was well established, hyperbolic, outbound, never to return. Still, the thought lingered in anxious corners of the mind. What if the object revealed intentions only at the last moment? Others spoke of invisible companions, smaller fragments travelling with it, perhaps undetected scouts seeded into our planetary neighbourhood. These speculations thrived in part because of history. Oumuamua's unexplained acceleration had never been resolved, leaving a residue of suspicion. If one visitor had behaved strangely, why not another? Fear is often born in the same cradle as wonder. At universities, debates expanded from astronomy into philosophy, sociology, even political science. Professors posed questions to students. If humanity discovered indisputable evidence of an alien probe, how should we respond? Would we attempt contact or remain silent in case we were being evaluated? Could our divisions as nations withstand the pressure of such a revelation, or would the presence of a common other finally unite us? The conversations were speculative but serious, conducted with the awareness that while Atlas might never answer these questions, its very presence had already forced us to ask them. One curious development was the way local myths absorbed the visitor. In Hawaii, storytellers began to link Atlas to the goddess Pele, describing it as a spark she had cast into the heavens. In parts of West Africa, griots wove the comet into traditional tales, framing it as a wandering ancestor searching for descendants across the stars. These reinterpretations showed that mysteries are never neutral. They become woven into the fabric of human meaning. Just as ancient peoples had looked at comets as omens, so too modern societies clothed Atlas in cultural garb. The difference lay in the context. Satellites and spectroscopes joined myth and metaphor, science standing shoulder to shoulder with legend, neither able to fully displace the other. Meanwhile, scientists pressed on with relentless patience. The James Webb Telescope refined its analysis, suggesting Atlas contained crystalline silicates, minerals that form in high-temperature regions close to stars. This contradicted other evidence pointing to formation in the cold outer reaches of a system. How could both be true? Some proposed that Atlas was a fragment of a larger body, torn apart in a collision that had mixed inner and outer material. Others speculated about complex migration within alien solar systems, the object bearing scars of journeys we could scarcely imagine. Each hypothesis seemed to reveal more layers rather than fewer, like peeling an onion only to find another onion beneath. For the public, these scientific nuances blurred into a single impression. The object refused to be ordinary. Whether natural or not, it was extraordinary by the very act of defying classification. And so gatherings continued. In Paris, an orchestra performed a symphony inspired by Atlas, movements shifting from delicate whispers of strings to booming crescendos of brass, echoing the object's cycles of brightness. In Mexico City, murals bloomed on concrete walls, painting Atlas as a great eye watching Earth. In Nairobi, schoolchildren built paper models of comets, carrying them in parades while teachers explained orbital paths in simple terms. Atlas had become a story not just for scientists but for everyone, a global myth unfolding in real time. As November drew to a close, the object began to fade slightly, its brightness pulses less dramatic, its halo shrinking as it sped outward. Yet rather than diminishing interest, this fading intensified attention. People sensed the story's end approaching. Soon Atlas would be too faint for even the best instruments, slipping into the same obscurity from which it had arrived. The knowledge that it would never return gave every observation, every discussion, a bittersweet edge. We were witnesses to a once-in-history moment, and the fleeting nature of the encounter made it precious. Children born in those months would one day be told that they were alive when an interstellar wanderer passed by, that for a brief season humanity looked up together and wondered. In its silence, Atlas had spoken loudly. It reminded us that the cosmos is not static but dynamic, alive with travellers who slip unexpectedly into our skies. It reminded us that meaning is not given but made, that we clothe the unknown in the garments of story, ritual, and art. And it reminded us that science, though powerful, does not always erase mystery. Sometimes it amplifies it, sharpening our sense of how little we truly understand. Whether comet or craft, relic or riddle, Atlas had already accomplished something remarkable. It had awakened humanity's imagination on a global scale, and as it prepared to continue its silent journey outward, the question it left behind remained suspended in the air like a note that refuses to resolve. What truly had we witnessed drifting among the stars? By December, the great traveller had begun its long retreat, slipping outward through the lanes of the solar system like a guest who had left a crowded room without farewell. Each night, telescopes recorded its steady diminishing glow. The pulses of brightness that had once captivated audiences now softer, less distinct. For scientists, this was expected. Comets brighten near the sun and fade as they depart, and yet the fading carried emotional weight, for it meant that the story was nearing its end. Humanity had been granted only a season with Atlas, a brief crossing of paths with a wanderer who had travelled for millions of years. That brevity gave the encounter a fragile beauty. It felt like holding a snowflake on the palm, glittering intricate and gone before one could fully study it. Astronomers pursued every last photon. The giant mirrors of Hawaii, Chile, and the Canary Islands strained against the limits of detection, their images capturing nothing more than faint smudges that had to be teased from background noise. The James Webb Telescope managed longer exposures, revealing the coma thinning, its gases dissipating into the dark. Spectra became harder to extract, the chemical lines weaker, their messages reduced to whispers. Yet even whispers had meaning. Some scientists noted that the ratios of certain isotopes remained inconsistent with known comets, continuing the puzzle that had defined Atlas since its arrival. Others argued that the fading itself was anomalous, slower than expected, as if the object retained an energy source beyond simple sublimation. These debates filled conferences and papers, but the truth was clear. The window of observation was closing, and with it the chance for certainty. As the data waned, the cultural resonance only grew. People sensed that they were living through the final chapter of the story, and they wanted to mark it in ways that felt lasting. In Berlin, a theatre troupe staged a play titled The Visitor, in which Atlas was portrayed as a silent character, moving through scenes of human history, unseen yet shaping events. In Cape Town, a choir performed hymns under the open sky, their harmonies rising toward the patch where the comet drifted unseen to the naked eye. In San Francisco, digital artists projected Atlas's orbital path onto the walls of buildings, the line glowing like a neon scar across the night. Each expression carried the same impulse, to give permanence to an impermanent event. Ordinary people created their own rituals. Families set alarms for midnight and drove out of cities to lie on blankets, staring into the dark, even if they could see nothing more than a sky full of stars. Teachers assigned projects asking children to write letters to Atlas, messages they would never send but which allowed them to articulate hopes for contact, or gratitude for the reminder of cosmic wonder. Some communities lit lanterns and released them into the night, a symbolic farewell gesture. In these small acts, humanity revealed its desire not to let the moment pass unmarked. We cling to ceremony when confronted with the fleeting. Atlas, though indifferent, had become the centre of countless ceremonies of farewell. Scientists, though cautious, also allowed themselves moments of reflection. A senior astronomer at the European Southern Observatory described it during a press briefing. We may never know for certain what Atlas was. That uncertainty is not failure, it is a gift. It forces us to expand our imaginations, to build instruments capable of more, and to remain humble before the cosmos. Her words echoed across headlines, reminding the public that science too finds poetry in ambiguity. The visitor had resisted classification, but in doing so it had sharpened the tools of inquiry. Already proposals were being drafted for new missions, interstellar object interceptors, probes capable of rapid launch to chase such wanderers in real time. Atlas might be gone, but its legacy would be future readiness. Meanwhile, the probe hypothesis refused to fade. A handful of anomalies remained stubbornly resistant to explanation. The improbable trajectory near 3 planets, the faint but regular pulses of brightness, the symmetrical coma. Skeptics dismissed these as artifacts of limited data. Believers saw them as fingerprints of intent. In coffee shops, podcasts, and late-night discussions, the same refrain returned. What if? The lack of closure kept the door ajar. To many, Atlas became less about proof and more about possibility. It was a thought experiment written in the stars, asking us to imagine what contact might look like if it arrived not with trumpets and lights, but with ambiguity, subtle enough to test our perception. Cultural theorists pointed out that Atlas had become a myth in real time. Unlike the myths of ancient comets, which were recorded long after their appearance, this one was unfolding with cameras, telescopes, and digital media. People were archiving every moment, debating every anomaly, creating art even as the object passed. Future generations would inherit not just a memory, but a vast digital footprint of humanity's collective encounter. Atlas was, in a sense, the first truly global cosmic myth, shared instantly across continents, interpreted simultaneously through science, religion, art, and speculation. Its impact would not vanish with its fading light. It would linger in archives, literature, and memory. As December deepened, Atlas grew harder to track. Only the largest instruments could catch it now, and even then with difficulty. Amateur astronomers reluctantly packed away their telescopes, aware that the visitor had slipped beyond their reach. Some spoke of a strange emptiness, as though the sky itself had grown quieter. For months they had oriented their nights around a single moving speck. Its absence was felt not only in data but in emotion. Humans are creatures of attachment, and in a way many had grown attached to this silent guest. Its departure felt like loss. Yet with the loss came gratitude, the knowledge that, however briefly, they had shared the sky with something ancient and extraordinary. Governments and institutions also began to close their books. Reports summarized the findings: unusual but inconclusive chemistry, anomalous but explainable trajectory, no definitive evidence of artificial origin. Yet between the lines one could sense hesitation, as though officials were reluctant to declare finality. The possibility, however slim, of something more lingered like a shadow. Files would be archived, but the mystery remained alive in minds and conversations. Some speculated that even if evidence had been stronger, it might never have been fully disclosed. Others argued that transparency had prevailed, that mystery was inherent, not manufactured. In the end, the silence of Atlas was matched by the silence of certainty. As the year drew to a close, writers began to summarize the event in retrospectives. They compared it to Oumuamua and Borisov, placing Atlas as the third in a trilogy of interstellar visitors, each stranger than the last. They noted that while the first had provoked debates, and the second had seemed more ordinary, the third had refused to be either. Atlas had balance between categories, embodying the liminal space where science and speculation meet. In that balance lay its power. It had not confirmed alien life, nor had it ruled it out. Instead, it had forced humanity to live with the tension of not knowing, to accept that some mysteries resist resolution. And so Atlas continued outward, invisible now to most eyes, yet vivid in imagination. Its path would carry it back into the deep silence between stars, where it might wander for millions of years before crossing another system, sparking another round of wonder for beings unknown. For us, its legacy was not in answers, but in questions. It had reminded us that the universe is vast, that visitors can arrive without warning, and that meaning is often found not in certainty, but in the act of searching. Atlas had come and gone, but in its brief sojourn through our skies it had etched itself into the story of humanity, not as a solved riddle, but as a question mark that glows, faint and eternal, against the darkness. When January arrived and Atlas had slipped almost entirely beyond reach, What remained was not the dim speck in the sky, but the echo of its presence across human thought. The telescopes that had followed it, with relentless discipline, now turned toward other targets, nebulae, exoplanets, the distant galaxies whose light had been travelling for billions of years. But the absence of nightly updates left a quiet space, a sense of unfinished conversation. Scientists archived their data, students filed their reports, and yet a strange restlessness lingered. The visitor was gone, but its mystery had not departed with it. If anything, the lack of new information amplified the resonance of what little had been gathered. It was as if the silence of space had become louder once the comet was no longer visible. The process of interpretation accelerated. Journals published special issues compiling the findings, anomalous isotopes, irregular brightness pulses, unexpected molecular ratios. Each paper added a piece to the puzzle, but the pieces refused to interlock. Some articles concluded that Atlas was simply an unusual comet, one forged in conditions different from those of our system. Others allowed more speculative edges, hinting that the possibility of artificiality could not be entirely excluded. The language was careful, but readers sensed the tremor beneath it, the recognition that science had brushed against a question it could not answer. Conferences filled with discussions not only of the object itself, but of methodology. How does one study something that refuses to fit into categories? How do you test for intent when faced with silence? In the public sphere, the interpretations multiplied with the speed of rumour. Conspiracy forums declared with confidence that Atlas had been a probe, and that governments knew more than they admitted. Documentaries on streaming platforms leaned heavily on dramatic music, presenting the anomalies as evidence of deliberate design. Talk shows invited guests who spoke of ancient aliens, of surveillance from afar, of hidden civilizations keeping watch. Against these louder voices, scientists tried to inject caution, repeating that absence of explanation is not proof of anything extraordinary. Yet the more cautious the language, the more people read between the lines, imagining cover-ups where none may have existed. In a world already primed by mistrust, Atlas became another mirror reflecting suspicion. But there were gentler interpretations too. Writers turned to metaphor, framing Atlas as a parable about humility. A poet in Ireland published a collection titled The Visitor Who Would Not Speak, its verses describing the comet as a teacher whose lesson was silence. An essayist in Argentina wrote that Atlas reminded us of travellers we meet briefly on trains, strangers whose presence changes us even though we never learn their names. In these softer accounts, the object was less an alien probe and more a symbol of transience, a reminder that the cosmos is filled with brief encounters that defy explanation. Religions continued to adapt the story to their own languages. In churches, preachers reminded congregations that mysteries in the heavens have always been signs of the divine. In temples, monks spoke of Atlas as an impermanent guest, a reminder of cycles beyond human control. Some indigenous groups, particularly in South America, folded the visitor into oral traditions, speaking of it as a wandering ancestor returning to check on descendants. These reinterpretations were less about proof and more about resonance. Humanity has always made myths of comets, and this one, with its extraordinary ambiguity, demanded myth more strongly than most. Meanwhile, technology companies seized on the imagery. Advertising campaigns used Atlas as a metaphor for exploration, resilience, or mystery. Logos incorporated comet trails, apps were named after the visitor, and one smartphone manufacturer released a limited edition model branded with its name. Critics complained that commercialization cheapened the wonder, but in another sense it confirmed the depth of the object's cultural penetration. When a scientific anomaly becomes an icon on billboards, it has transcended its origins. Among scientists, the story did not fade, but evolved. Proposals for new missions gained traction. The European Space Agency began discussing rapid response probes that could launch within months of a future interstellar object's detection. NASA engineers revived earlier studies of solar sail interceptors, craft that could chase down fast-moving bodies like Atlas. The consensus was clear: humanity must be ready for the next visitor. Atlas had shown that these objects are not rare flukes, but recurring guests. To ignore them would be to ignore opportunities to learn not only about other systems, but perhaps about other intelligences. In this way, the ambiguity of Atlas became fuel for preparation. Even without answers, it pushed us forward. Among ordinary people, the comet lived on a story. Parents told children about the time the world had shared a mystery. Teachers included it in lessons, not as a solved case but as an example of living science, where questions remain open. Artists continue to create, musicians continue to compose, writers continue to imagine. The comet had vanished from the sky, but it had lodged itself into the collective imagination. And there it would remain, long after the data had faded into archives. One striking aspect was how the story fractured into multiple futures. For some, Atlas became a tale of disappointment, another anomaly that dissolved under scrutiny, leaving nothing more than dust. For others, it became proof of alien surveillance, a confirmation of long-held suspicions. For still others, it was a symbol of mystery itself, a reminder that not everything must be explained. These divergent readings meant that Atlas would never settle into a single narrative. Instead, it would live on as a constellation of interpretations, each shaped by the world view of the interpreter. In this sense, Atlas was less a comet than a mirror, reflecting back the diversity of human belief. As months passed, the visitor grew fainter still, until only the most powerful instruments could detect it. Eventually, even they fell silent, the object now too distant to track with certainty. It had crossed the boundary of observation, returned to anonymity in the interstellar dark. And yet the story did not end with disappearance. On the contrary, disappearance amplified the myth. We are creatures who cling most tightly to what we cannot hold. Atlas had given us a season of wonder, and in vanishing it had ensured that the wonder would last. Some scientists speculated that one day, perhaps in hundreds of thousands of years, the object might pass close to another star, sparking curiosity among beings we cannot imagine. Perhaps they too would debate whether it was natural or artificial, whether it was stone or machine. In that speculation lay a comforting thought. Atlas was not only our mystery, but part of a larger story of how civilizations across the galaxy might encounter travellers from the void. The enigma we wrestled with might be one thread in a tapestry of mysteries stretching across countless skies. And so, Atlas left us with silence. Silence filled by suspicion, by poetry, by ritual, by plans for the future. Its gift was not certainty but imagination. It taught us that even in an age of powerful instruments and instant communication, mystery has not been banished. It lingers, waiting to remind us that we live in a universe vast enough to surprise us still. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the visitor, that in its quiet passing, it awakened our restless capacity to wonder. The year after Atlas's departure felt oddly quieter, though the skies were no less filled with stars. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, traffic on streets, commerce in markets, elections, festivals. But beneath it all, the memory of the visitor lingered like a faint afterimage burned into the collective eye. Newspapers had stopped running daily updates, and television anchors no longer gestured toward animated diagrams of orbital paths, but the story had not vanished. Instead, it had migrated into the slower currents of culture, drifting into books, classrooms, films, and conversations that began with the words, "Do you remember?" Atlas had already begun its transformation from event into legend. Scientific circles processed the encounter with a mixture of closure and anticipation. Conferences convened sessions titled Lessons from Atlas, where astronomers presented charts comparing its chemistry to that of known comets. The debates over its anomalous isotopes, the strange uniformity of its coma, and the improbable trajectory were revisited with the calm distance of hindsight. Most agreed that nothing conclusively alien had been discovered, yet none denied the oddities. Papers concluded with careful phrasing. Further study of future interstellar objects will be required to resolve such anomalies. The phrase became almost a refrain, a reminder that Atlas's greatest gift might be the preparation it forced. Agencies began allocating funds for rapid intercept missions, a concept once dismissed as impractical, but now seen as urgent. Blueprints circulated for spacecraft that could be launched within weeks of a new discovery, designed to chase and study the next wanderer. Though Atlas itself was gone, its shadow stretched into the budgets and agendas of science. For the public, the absence of new data created space for interpretation. Atlas became a story told in classrooms where teachers encouraged students to imagine what it might have been. Was it a comet, a relic of star formation, or something more? Children wrote essays and drew pictures, some depicting icy rocks tumbling through black space, others sketching gleaming machines disguised as comets. In literature, it appeared as metaphor. A novel from Japan framed it as a symbol of unspoken love. A character compared to a visitor who enters one's life only briefly, leaving behind an indelible mystery. In film, documentaries retold the story with dramatized music and speculative imagery, while science fiction directors began weaving it into scripts about alien watchers and silent emissaries. The line between fact and imagination blurred, as it always does when humanity encounters something that resists explanation. Religions continued to absorb the visitor into their mythologies. In sermons, preachers compared Atlas to the parables of the Bible, enigmatic signs that demanded interpretation rather than provided it. In Hindu communities, some linked the comet to the wandering sages of old, calling it a rishi of the sky, who came to observe but not to intervene. In indigenous traditions across North America, storytellers spoke of Atlas as a spirit animal, cloaked in ice, visiting the Earth to remind humans of humility. These readings varied widely, but they shared a common trait. They treated the object not as a mere rock, but as a messenger, silent yet significant. The silence itself became the message, inviting people to reflect on how they interpret the unknown. Governments, for their part, tried to move on, yet the visitor haunted policy in subtle ways. Intelligence agencies retained their files, some declassified for public release, others sealed away. Leaked documents hinted that radio telescopes had detected faint periodic bursts coinciding with Atlas's brightness pulses, though the official explanation remained instrumental noise. To skeptics, this sounded like dismissal. To believers, it sounded like confirmation cloaked in denial. The lack of closure fueled conspiracy theories that thrived in online spaces. Atlas had been a probe, they claimed, and governments knew but withheld the truth to prevent panic. The more officials insisted otherwise, the more the mistrust deepened. In this way, the comet continued to shape discourse long after its light had faded. Artists found lasting inspiration in the enigma. Painters depicted Atlas as a glowing seed carried through cosmic winds, a symbol of potential life scattered across the galaxy. Sculptors carved stone orbs with cracks of light running through them, representing the tension between natural and artificial. Musicians composed symphonies with movements that pulsed rhythmically, echoing the brightness cycles recorded during its passage. Theatre companies staged performances where Atlas was personified as a silent traveller who walked among humans, unseen but transformative. Each creative act revealed the same truth. The mystery had entered the bloodstream of culture, inseparable from art and imagination. For ordinary people, Atlas remained a memory woven into personal narratives. Couples recalled lying on blankets, gazing upward during its closest approach. Children remembered their parents explaining the strange visitor at the dinner table. Amateur astronomers preserved their grainy photographs like relics, framed and hung in living rooms. The event had touched millions, even those who never saw the object themselves because it had become a shared story. People do not need to see a mystery directly to feel its presence. They only need to know that others are looking up at the same sky. Atlas had given humanity a season of collective wonder, and that sense of unity endured. Some saw in its departure a deeper lesson about impermanence. Just as civilizations rise and fall, just as people enter and exit each other's lives, so too do cosmic wanderers come and go. The briefness of the encounter was precisely what made it precious. In that sense, Atlas became a mirror for the human condition, finite, fleeting, and meaningful precisely because of its transience. The comet reminded us that even in the grand theatre of the cosmos, meaning arises not from permanence but from the act of noticing, of cherishing the moment before it vanishes. Scholars of myth and anthropology began to write about Atlas in terms usually reserved for ancient stories. They compared it to comets that had once terrified medieval peasants or inspired the building of monuments in antiquity. The difference, they noted, was that Atlas's myth had unfolded in real time, across a global audience connected by digital networks. Never before had a cosmic visitor been observed, debated, mythologized, and commercialized so quickly and so widely. The myth was not recorded centuries later. It was born instantly, alive across screens, conversations, and artworks. For future historians, this would be one of Atlas's strangest legacies, a living myth, captured in tweets, videos, and data files, proof that even in the 21st century, the human hunger for story had not diminished. And so Atlas continued outward, invisible now, its path carrying it into the cold gulf between stars. Perhaps it would wander for millions of years before brushing against another system, where other beings might watch and wonder as we had. Perhaps it would drift forever, unseen, its silence eternal. But for humanity, its meaning endured. It was no longer simply a comet or probe or question. It was a symbol, a reminder that the universe is not exhausted by our explanations, that mystery remains, that the skies can still surprise us. Whether one saw it as a relic of creation, a disguised emissary, or simply a rock that sparked poetry, Atlas had given the world something rare, a season when science and imagination shared the same sky. In that sense, the legend of Atlas had only begun. Long after the visitor itself was gone, long after the last photons from its coma had been recorded, the story lived on, in art, in memory, in the quiet wonder that lingers whenever we lift our eyes to the stars and remember the time a traveller came, stayed briefly, and left us with more questions than answers. A decade after Atlas's brief passage, the visitor's name still lingered in conversations like a faint echo. By then, most people no longer remembered the nightly headlines or the blurry photographs, but the myth of the traveller persisted. It had threaded itself into scientific initiatives, cultural debates, and even political rhetoric. When leaders spoke of investing in space infrastructure, they sometimes invoked Atlas as a reminder that the universe does not wait for us to be ready. The visitor had passed without warning, and humanity had scrambled to observe it with the instruments available. Next time, they insisted, we must be prepared. Atlas had become shorthand for the unexpected, a symbol of opportunities lost to hesitation. In research centres across the world, the practical legacy was visible. Projects that once seemed futuristic had gained momentum. Space agencies had begun constructing interstellar interceptors, small, nimble spacecraft designed to remain on standby, ready to launch at short notice toward the next hyperbolic visitor. The European Space Agency's Oracle project, for instance, was a direct child of Atlas. Engineers often admitted that the comet's ambiguity, its refusal to be neatly explained, had fueled the urgency to create machines capable of chasing such mysteries before they slipped away again. NASA, China's CNSA, and private companies followed suit, each sketching designs for sails, ion drives, or nuclear-powered probes that could accelerate fast enough to catch up with the next wanderer. The future of planetary defense, exploration, and perhaps even diplomacy with the unknown had been reshaped by a single brief encounter. Beyond hardware, Atlas influenced theory. In astronomy departments, seminars still debated the object's chemistry and behaviour. Younger researchers who had been students during the flyby now led their own teams, re-examining the data with fresher tools. Machine learning algorithms trawled through the old spectra, sometimes flagging subtle patterns missed at the time. A few of these analyses revived the debate over regularity in the brightness pulses. Was there a hidden rhythm? Could the pulses have been a form of non-random modulation? The majority remained sceptical, but even skepticism acknowledged the importance of asking. Atlas had trained a generation of scientists to consider questions that bordered on philosophy. How would we recognize intent if it came disguised as nature? Where is the line between anomaly and artifact, between chance and design? In universities, the comet had become a teaching tool beyond astronomy. Courses in philosophy used it as a case study in epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. Professors asked students to wrestle with the tension between evidence and interpretation, between open-mindedness and gullibility. In sociology, it became an example of how global culture reacts to mystery, how myths form in real time, and how belief spreads in digital ecosystems. In literature, it appeared as metaphor for fleeting love, for unanswerable questions, for strangers who pass through lives without explanation. The very fact that Atlas could be studied across so many disciplines testified to its transformation into legend. It was no longer confined to science. It had migrated into the bloodstream of culture. Religious communities continued to weave Atlas into sermons and rituals. In some churches, it was remembered as the silent angel, a messenger that passed without words. In Hindu circles, it was spoken of as a wandering sage who teaches by leaving questions unanswered. Indigenous storytellers folded it into oral traditions, describing it as a sky being who came to check on humanity and found us still searching. Even atheists and secular thinkers adopted the language of reverence, speaking of Atlas not as divine but as sublime, a reminder of how vast the universe is and how small we remain within it. The silence of the visitor had become fertile ground for every tradition to plant meaning. Politically, the comet's ghost influenced international cooperation. In the aftermath of Atlas, the United Nations had convened a working group on interstellar objects and human response. At first, the discussions were symbolic, filled with lofty statements about cooperation. But as years passed and new surveys detected more candidates for interstellar visitors, the tone shifted. Should nations share data immediately? Should an object suspected of being artificial be treated as a matter of global security? Could humanity agree on protocols for contact, or even for recognition of contact? The debates were heated, often tangled with suspicion, but the fact that they occurred at all was significant. Atlas had planted the seed of preparedness, forcing the world to consider not only scientific but ethical and political implications of cosmic encounters. For ordinary people, Atlas lived on in quieter ways. Novels continued to use it as metaphor, films continued to dramatize it, and songs continued to pulse with rhythms echoing its mysterious brightness cycles. Children who had been small when it passed grew up with the story as part of their cultural backdrop, a tale their parents told of the time the world looked up together. Amateur astronomers who had pointed telescopes at the faint smudge during its approach now told grandchildren about it, showing them framed photographs, shaky images that meant little on their own, but everything when coupled with memory. It had become part of family lore, proof that even in a digital age of saturated entertainment, the cosmos could still provide moments of awe that no algorithm could manufacture. At the same time, conspiracy theories had not faded. Some corners of the internet continued to insist that Atlas had been a probe, and that governments had hidden the evidence. Claims circulated of secret images captured by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, of intercepted transmissions, of objects left behind in near-Earth space. None of these were substantiated, but they persisted because the mystery had never been closed. Ambiguity is fertile soil for belief, and Atlas remained a fertile field. For some, it was not just a comet but a symbol of mistrust in authority, an emblem of secrecy and denial. Even in this distorted form it shaped discourse, reminding us that mysteries are never neutral, they become vessels for our hopes, fears and suspicions. Perhaps the most striking legacy was philosophical. Atlas had forced humanity to confront the possibility that contact might not arrive in dramatic fashion, but in ambiguity, cloaked as nature. It had reminded us that extraordinary things do not always announce themselves with certainty. They may slip into our skies quietly, leaving us unsure whether we have been touched by the extraordinary or merely brushed by chance. That lesson lingered in quiet conversations, over coffee, on long walks, in classrooms where teachers posed the question, what if we missed it? What if that was contact, and we did not recognize it? Such questions unsettled and inspired in equal measure. They revealed how Atlas had not only been an astronomical event, but also a philosophical one, shaking the ground beneath our assumptions about recognition and meaning. And so, 10 years after the visitor had passed, it remained vivid. Not as a bright point in the sky, but as a symbol etched into memory. It had given science new urgency, culture new metaphors, politics new debates, and philosophy new questions. Whether comet, construct, or coincidence, Atlas had changed us. Its body had drifted into the interstellar dark, but its shadow remained here, cast across our imaginations. In that shadow we found both humility and wonder, reminders that the universe is vast enough to surprise us still. The legend of Atlas had outlived its light, and perhaps that was always its truest gift. By the time the second decade after Atlas dawned, the cosmos had offered more wanderers. A handful of faint streaks had been catalogued as possible interstellar objects, each stirring brief waves of interest, though none carried the same resonance as the visitor that had passed in 2025. They were studied, logged, and quickly folded into the expanding database of astronomical phenomena. Yet always, without fail, they were measured against Atlas. No paper could discuss a new object without invoking its name. No press release could describe an interstellar detection without referencing the mystery of the earlier traveller. Atlas had become the benchmark, the ghost by which all others were judged. The telescopes had improved. Networks of sky surveys now scan the heavens with astonishing sensitivity, their automated algorithms capable of flagging new visitors within hours. These systems, partly funded by the cultural and political momentum Atlas had generated, were designed to prevent humanity from ever being caught unprepared again. When a faint hyperbolic streak was discovered in 2033, probes were readied within weeks, though the object turned out to be small, a fragment of ice that quickly evaporated as it neared the sun. Its ordinariness disappointed some, but others found relief in the contrast. Not every interstellar guest would be Atlas. Yet even in its banality, the new comet reminded people of the earlier enigma, proving again how strongly Atlas's shadow lingered. The most ambitious attempt to capture such a visitor came in the form of the Chaser program, a fleet of small spacecraft kept in storage orbit near Earth, ready to launch on ion drives toward any newly discovered hyperbolic path. The project was the direct offspring of Atlas's ambiguity. The very fact that we had not been able to reach Atlas had become the justification for ensuring we never missed the chance again. Engineers designed the probes to be modular, capable of rapid assembly and deployment. They carried spectrographs, images, and even instruments capable of attempting communication if an object ever betrayed signs of artificiality. Some critics scoffed at the last feature, calling it wasteful. But defenders argued that if there was even a 1 in 10,000 chance of such contact, it was worth the weight of a small transmitter. Atlas taught us humility, one engineer remarked, and humility means preparing for the improbable. Meanwhile, cultural fascination did not fade. Each new detection reignited discussions of the earlier visitor. Documentaries replayed the grainy images of Atlas, layering them with speculative narration about hidden probes, alien reconnaissance, or lost civilizations. Writers continued to mine it for metaphor. A Nigerian novelist crafted a story of a wanderer who enters villages silently, reshaping destinies by presence alone, modelled after Atlas's passage. A French filmmaker produced a hauntingly slow film called The Silence of Atlas, in which the comet was never shown directly, only reflected in the reactions of characters on Earth. The ambiguity remained fertile ground for creativity, and audiences decades later were still willing to be moved by a mystery unresolved. For scientists, however, Atlas's influence was more sobering. They found themselves confronting the limits of evidence. The data we had gathered, spectra, images, light curves, were all real, yet interpretation remained slippery. One camp insisted that everything could be explained within the bounds of natural cometary physics, if only one accounted for unusual formation environments. Another camp continued to point out that no explanation fully satisfied all anomalies, that some patterns seemed too regular, too deliberate. The debates were less heated than before, but they endured, like a background hum in astronomy conferences. Papers still ended with the phrase, "Atlas remains a case study in the challenges of interpretation." Its unsolved nature had become a reminder that science is not only about answers, but also about living with open questions. Philosophers seized upon that point. They argued that Atlas symbolized the edge of knowledge, a reminder that not every truth is immediately accessible. A prominent ethicist wrote that the visitor should be remembered not only as a scientific anomaly, but as a moral challenge. Would humanity recognize otherness if it came cloaked in ambiguity? Would we treat silence as absence, or as presence too subtle for our instruments? The question migrated into classrooms, into literature, into public discourse. Atlas became a metaphor not only for extraterrestrial contact, but for human encounters with difference, with strangers, with the unknown in all its forms. Religious traditions kept weaving it deeper into their language. In some communities, anniversaries of its closest approach were marked with vigils or prayers. In others, it was remembered as a lesson in humility, a cosmic reminder that creation contains mysteries beyond comprehension. A few fringe sects even elevated Atlas into prophecy, declaring that its return, or the arrival of its kin, would herald transformation. While mainstream groups dismissed such claims, they underscored how powerfully the visitor had imprinted itself onto imagination. Its silence had become a screen upon which countless beliefs could be projected. Politically, Atlas's ghost still stirred caution. When international committees discussed protocols for potential contact, they used it as precedent. "Remember Atlas," one delegate said, "and remember how quickly speculation can spiral without clarity." The phrase Atlas Protocol began to circulate, shorthand for procedures that balanced transparency with restraint. The goal was to avoid both premature declarations and suspicious secrecy. Even if no object ever again inspired such debates, the framework was now part of humanity's governance of the unknown. In this way, the comet's ambiguity had seeded policy as surely as it had seeded art. For individuals, the memory softened into personal folklore. Elderly amateur astronomers told stories of staying up late to catch a glimpse through shaky telescopes. Middle-aged adults remembered the online debates of their youth, when the question of probe or comet filled feeds and chat rooms. Children who had grown up hearing of Atlas in classrooms now carried the legend as cultural background, a tale of their parents' generation. It had become what comets have always become, a story passed down, embroidered with interpretation, treasured not for certainty but for its refusal to resolve. Even as new interstellar visitors came and went, Atlas remained unique. Perhaps it was only chance, the right timing, the right anomalies, the right cultural readiness. Or perhaps it truly had been different, a messenger we had only half understood. The truth lay beyond reach, carried outward on a hyperbolic trajectory that ensured we would never see it again. Yet in its absence, it continued to shape us. It reminded us that sometimes a single season of mystery can ripple through decades, changing how we look at the sky, at science, at each other. And so, long after its light had faded from instruments, Atlas still glowed in memory. It was a comet, perhaps, or a construct, or something in between. But whatever it was, it had become part of our story, a reminder that we live in a universe vast enough to place enigmas in our skies, enigmas large enough to outlast the moment of their passing. We may never know what Atlas truly was, but in not knowing, we were changed. By the middle of the 21st century, Atlas had taken on a role larger than any single comet could bear. It was no longer merely the subject of archived data or conference footnotes. It had become a touchstone for how humanity imagined its own future in the cosmos. When space agencies unveiled long-range plans for interstellar probes, the images on their presentations often included the ghostly blur of Atlas, as though invoking the traveller lent legitimacy to ambition. When philosophers debated the ethics of artificial intelligence or the possibility of post-human civilizations, Atlas's silence was held up as an example of how contact might arrive without clarity. The visitor's refusal to explain itself had made it endlessly useful as a metaphor. It had become not just an event in 2025, but a companion for the decades that followed, an invisible presence in conversations about who we are and what we might become. In classrooms, teachers found that the story of Atlas could reach students more deeply than dry lectures about orbital mechanics or spectral analysis. Children leaned forward when told of the comet that passed by in silence, carrying mysteries no one could solve. They asked questions. What if it was a machine? What if it was alive? What if it was just a rock, but still beautiful? Teachers used these questions to spark lessons in critical thinking, reminding students that sometimes the most important skill is not answering, but learning how to live with uncertainty. Atlas had become a curriculum in itself, a case study in humility. Science fiction continued to thrive on its ambiguity. Novels reimagined Atlas as a disguised ark carrying sleeping beings across millennia. Films portrayed it as a silent scout, returning to its makers with data about humanity's fragile blue world. Virtual reality experiences let users drift alongside it, watching stars wheel past as the comet carried them beyond the solar system. Each creation diverged wildly, but all shared the seed of mystery left behind in 2025. In this sense, Atlas was like an ancient myth retold in countless variations, each new version reshaping the story, but never exhausting its power. Scientists, however, had not abandoned the quest for clarity. By the 2040s, rapid response interceptors had become reality, and one was launched toward an interstellar visitor catalogued as Tyche. The mission succeeded in snapping close-range photographs, revealing a body unmistakably natural, an icy fragment with chaotic jets and irregular rotation. The data were spectacular, but for the public, the disappointment was palpable. Tyche lacked the intrigue of Atlas. It was a comet, nothing more. Journalists wrote that humanity had expected another mystery, but instead received confirmation of the ordinary. Yet even this contrast strengthened Atlas's legend. By being the exception, it stood taller, its refusal to conform highlighted by the ordinariness of those that followed. In philosophy, Atlas took on the role of a thought experiment. Scholars debated how civilizations might intentionally present themselves to others. Would they send clear signals, unambiguous and loud? Or would they choose ambiguity, a test of perception and patience? Atlas, they suggested, might have been the latter. Perhaps it was not meant to prove anything but to provoke questions, to observe how humanity reacted to uncertainty. The idea gained traction not because there was evidence for it, but because it resonated with human experience, the sense that life's deepest encounters often arrive not with answers, but with riddles. Religious thinkers also adapted the metaphor. In some traditions, Atlas was described as a parable about divine silence, the idea that revelation does not always come in words or miracles, but in brief appearances that resist explanation. In others, it became a lesson in stewardship. If the universe sends visitors, even ambiguous ones, then perhaps humanity's role is to prepare not only to observe, but to welcome. These interpretations gave the comet spiritual endurance, ensuring that even as direct memory faded, its presence lingered in ritual and reflection. Politically, Atlas's shadow influenced the rhetoric of exploration. When governments debated funding for lunar bases or Mars missions, advocates often invoked the visitor. "We are a species that waits for mysteries to come to us," they warned, "but we must also go to meet them." Atlas was proof that the cosmos could knock on our door at any moment. To ignore that fact was to risk being unready again. In this way, the comet became a subtle driver of investment, a symbol wielded in budget hearings and campaign speeches. Few events in history had been so ambiguous yet so consequential in shaping policy. For ordinary people, the story softened into nostalgia. Adults who had been children in 2025 recalled staying up late with their parents, staring at stars, even if they never actually saw the comet itself. Artists still painted it, musicians still composed for it, storytellers still evoked it. Yet more often it appeared in the background, part of a shared cultural memory. It had become like Halley's Comet in earlier centuries, something people spoke of with a mix of pride and wistfulness. I was alive when Atlas passed. The comet was gone, but the sense of belonging to its season endured. Even conspiracy theories found new fuel. Decades had not dimmed suspicion that governments knew more than they admitted. Every new space mission, every classified budget line, every unexplained radio anomaly was tied back to Atlas by those who saw in its silence proof of deception. For them, it was less about the comet itself than about mistrust of authority. Atlas had become a cipher, a shape into which suspicion could be poured endlessly. Ironically, this kept its memory alive, ensuring it remained a subject of debate long after the science had moved on. But perhaps the deepest legacy of Atlas was philosophical. It taught humanity to dwell in uncertainty without collapsing into despair. It reminded us that the universe may not provide clean answers, that meaning often emerges not from resolution, but from the act of questioning. In this way, Atlas was not only about astronomy, but about the human condition. We are creatures who crave clarity, yet we live in a cosmos that often resists it. Atlas gave us a season of ambiguity, and, in doing so, revealed how much we can learn simply by holding the question open. By the middle of the century, Atlas was no longer visible in the sky, nor measurable by instruments, but it remained vividly present in imagination. It was a comet, perhaps, or a probe, or something we had not yet conceived. Its truth had vanished with it, carried into the interstellar dark. Yet its shadow remained with us, shaping science, inspiring art, guiding politics, and deepening philosophy. It had become part of our story, a reminder that the unknown is not a gap to be closed, but a horizon to be lived with. And in that horizon, humanity found a strange kind of companionship. Atlas was gone, but in its absence it continued to walk beside us, as legend, as question, as silent guide. By the time humanity's first serious interstellar probes were launched in the latter half of the 21st century, Atlas had already become a quiet companion to the effort, like a ghost watching over the ships we built. Engineers did not speak of it in official documents, but in late-night conversations it was often invoked. "Remember Atlas," one project leader told her team before a crucial systems test. She did not need to elaborate. Everyone understood. To remember Atlas was to remember the urgency of readiness, the humility of mystery, and the lesson that opportunities slip away quickly if we're not prepared to seize them. The visitor had vanished, but its shadow stretched into the future, shaping the psychology of exploration itself. The first of these missions, launched under a coalition of agencies and private partners, was christened Horizon. Its target was not a known interstellar object, but simply the void itself, a journey beyond the heliopause into the great silence between stars. Yet from its earliest press releases, journalists connected it to Atlas. "We chase the silence," one headline declared, "because silence once chased us." The framing was poetic, but it carried weight. People remembered the comet's ambiguity, its unanswered questions, and they projected those questions onto the probe. What would it find, if anything? Would the mystery of Atlas ever be explained by future encounters, or would the silence only deepen? The mission carried no promises of answers, but it carried the inheritance of wonder. As the ship slipped from Earth's gravity and entered the long arc outward, writers and artists rushed to fill the void with imagination. Novels depicted the probe meeting another traveller, perhaps even Atlas itself, looping back in some impossible geometry of time. Film showed humanity's emissary chasing a faint light, never quite catching it, a metaphor for longing. Musicians composed symphonies with movements of rising crescendos, followed by unresolved silences, echoing the brightness pulses that had once defined the comet. The probe's journey became less about its scientific goals and more about its symbolic kinship with Atlas. In a way, it was less a machine than an answer, our attempt to respond to the question the comet had posed by its silence. Meanwhile, philosophy took the visitor into new territory. Thinkers began to describe Atlas as part of a cosmic dialogue, even if it had spoken no words. Perhaps, they argued, contact is not always explicit. Perhaps it is a matter of presence, of gestures subtle enough to be read only by those willing to interpret. The idea reshaped how people thought about otherness, whether alien or human. If a silent comet could be treated as a message, then perhaps silence itself carried meaning in our relationships, in our cultures, in our search for transcendence. In this way, Atlas became not only a question about the stars, but a lens through which people viewed one another. The cosmic visitor had quietly reshaped the ethics of listening. Religious traditions also carried its imprint forward. Pilgrimages began where people visited observatories that had once tracked the object, treating them as sacred sites. In South America, a festival was established each year on the anniversary of Atlas's perihelion, celebrated with lanterns released into the night sky. In India, some temples painted murals of the visitor alongside ancient celestial imagery, as if to remind devotees that the divine can arrive even in ambiguous form. In each case, the comet's silence was reinterpreted as a form of presence, a reminder that not every messenger announces itself loudly. Some arrive quietly, leaving us to wrestle with meaning on our own. The scientific legacy also grew. By now, interceptors had successfully reached several interstellar objects, capturing close images and sampling dust. Most proved natural, icy relics, dusty fragments, sometimes carrying exotic chemistries but nothing to suggest artifice. Yet every mission ended with the same note. None were quite like Atlas. Its anomalies remained unique, its rhythm unmatched. For every comet studied, the ghost of Atlas hovered in the background, asking whether it had been an exception or whether we simply had not yet found its kin. The absence of repetition only deepened the mystery. What was Atlas, if not representative of a larger class? Why had it been so singular? Culturally, Atlas's story began to merge with humanity's own ventures into interstellar space. Colonists departing for the outer planets or for long voyages often carried tokens inscribed with its name, as though invoking protection from the traveller who had once passed silently among us. Poets wrote that we were following Atlas outward, tracing its path into the unknown. Some even framed humanity's expansion as dialogue. We had seen a visitor, and now we ourselves were becoming visitors, carrying our silence into other skies. The myth of Atlas had become inseparable from the myth of humanity's journey. Politics also carried the memory forward. International treaties on space exploration invoke the principle of shared skies, a phrase born from the debates around Atlas's ambiguous nature. The idea was that no single nation could claim ownership of such mysteries. They belonged to all humanity. This principle extended into agreements about exoplanet exploration, about the sharing of data, about protocols for discovery. Atlas, by refusing to be classified, had ironically unified nations in the recognition that cosmic mysteries cannot be possessed. They can only be shared. Yet suspicion never fully vanished. Conspiracy theorists still whispered that Atlas had been more than we were told, that its silence had been intentional, that its departure was only apparent. Some argued that fragments remained, hidden in near-Earth space, watching us still. Others claimed the object had deposited probes, invisible but active, their presence betrayed by subtle anomalies in communication networks or power grids. None of these claims held scientific weight, but they thrived because Atlas had never closed the door on possibility. Its refusal to be ordinary had given suspicion permanent fuel. The legend thus fractured. For some, Atlas was a symbol of humility and wonder. For others, it was a symbol of secrecy and mistrust. Both readings, in their own way, ensured its endurance. For ordinary people, the comet became part of folklore. Grandparents told stories of how they had stayed up late to follow the news in 2025. Parents described the glow of headlines, the debates about alien probes, the strange sense of unity the visitor had brought. Children listened as though hearing fairy tales, stories of a silent traveller whose passing had stirred the whole world. Some asked whether it would return. The answer was always the same: no, its path carried it away forever. But the truth was more complicated, for in memory, in art, in culture, Atlas had never left. It remained orbiting us in imagination, bound to Earth not by gravity but by story. By the close of the century, Atlas had become less of a comet and more of a mythological archetype. It was invoked in poetry as the silent guest, in politics as the reminder of shared skies, in science as the case study in ambiguity. Its scientific data had long been catalogued, its light curves and spectra buried in archives. Yet its cultural light had only grown brighter. The visitor had entered the fabric of human identity, shaping how we thought about exploration, about contact, about silence. It had reminded us that even fleeting encounters can leave marks deeper than centuries of routine. And so, as humanity's ships crossed further outward, as colonies sprouted in distant orbits, as instruments scanned the skies for new wanderers, Atlas travelled with us still. Not in body, it was long gone into the interstellar dark, but in spirit, in story, in the questions it had left behind. We did not know what it had been. Perhaps we never would, but in our ignorance we found meaning. The silence of Atlas had become our companion, reminding us that mystery is not the absence of truth but the presence of possibility. Centuries after Atlas had swept silently through the inner solar system, its story endured, carried like an ember in the memory of a species that no longer confined itself to Earth. By then, humans lived in habitats orbiting moons, in colonies carved into asteroids, in ships that drifted between planets. Yet no matter how far they travelled, the myth of the visitor followed, woven into the fabric of culture as though it had been part of humanity's inheritance all along. Children on Mars learned of Atlas in their school books, their teachers describing it as a fleeting messenger that crossed the sky when their great-grandparents were young. On Titan, murals in colony halls painted the comet as a glowing pearl sliding past Saturn's rings. In O'Neill's cylinders orbiting Earth, poetry contests used Atlas as theme, young poets competing to capture the silence and mystery of the traveller in verse. The object itself was gone, beyond all reach, but in myth, it remained present everywhere humans had settled. The scientific data, by then, had been sifted for generations. Every spectrum, every image, every brightness curve had been reanalyzed with technologies undreamed of in the 21st century. Machine minds, vast in their processing, scanned for patterns in the pulses of light, modelling them against billions of hypothetical natural scenarios. Some algorithms concluded the signals could indeed be explained by exotic but natural processes, layered sublimation, rotational harmonics, outgassing sequences unfamiliar to Earth-born comets. Others, equally sophisticated, suggested that natural explanations failed to account for the precision of intervals, the improbable choreography of its planetary flybys. The verdict centuries later was the same as in 2025, undecidable. Atlas remained poised between chance and intention, forever refusing resolution. For philosophers, this irresolution became the heart of its meaning. Atlas was invoked as the archetype of the unknowable, the reminder that not all questions yield answers even with centuries of inquiry. Theologians in orbital monasteries spoke of it as a parable of divine silence, a messenger that pointed not to knowledge but to humility. Secular thinkers reframed it as a meditation on epistemology. Atlas reminded us that the universe is vast enough to generate enigmas that outlast civilizations. To the colonists who recited its story in nightly gatherings, it symbolized both hope and restraint. Hope, because it suggested that the galaxy might indeed contain other minds. Restraint, because it reminded them not to leap too quickly from anomaly to certainty. Culturally, Atlas's image had become stylized, abstracted from the grainy smudges captured in 2025 into symbols that adorned banners, artworks, and tattoos. Some represented it as a perfect circle haloed by light, others as an elongated spindle with faint trails. Each interpretation carried the same aura of ambiguity. Was it natural or artificial, comet or construct? People wore its image not to declare belief, but to align themselves with wonder. In bustling markets on Ceres, jewellery sellers offered pendants shaped like Atlas, promising luck to travellers. On long-haul ships to the Kuiper belt, captains carried carved stones etched with the comet's silhouette, tokens passed down like talismans. The visitor had become patron saint of voyagers, the silent companion of all who travelled into the dark. Politics, too, remembered Atlas. Interstellar treaties, debated among far-flung colonies, included the Atlas Clause, a principle stating that any ambiguous discovery must be shared with all settlements before conclusions were drawn. The clause was born from the memory of suspicion in 2025, when governments were accused of secrecy. Colonists demanded transparency, arguing that mysteries of the sky belong to all humanity. That principle, enshrined in interstellar law, was perhaps the comet's most tangible legacy. Atlas had forced our species to confront its divisions and to imagine a better way. Whether the clause was always honoured was another matter, but its invocation in debates showed the power of a legend to shape law. In art, Atlas remained inexhaustible. Martian playwrights staged dramas in which the visitor was a character, silent yet central, its presence shaping human choices without ever speaking a word. Poets on Luna wrote verses imagining conversations with the comet, asking questions and receiving only silence in return. Musicians composed symphonies with movements of unresolved chords, echoing the ambiguity of Atlas's nature. Even visual artists embraced its mystery. Holographic installations projected its trajectory across gallery ceilings, allowing visitors to walk beneath a glowing line that curved through darkness before vanishing into infinity. Each generation returned to Atlas as if to a wellspring, finding new ways to express what could never be fully captured. For ordinary people, Atlas had become part of folklore, told in stories beside artificial campfires in domes and aboard ships. Parents whispered to children, "Once a visitor came from the stars and left us with questions that no one could answer." Children would ask, "Will it come back?" The answer, as always, was no. Its orbit carried it into the infinite. But sometimes parents would smile and add, "Perhaps others will." In this way, Atlas was less about the past than the future, a story that pointed outward toward what might yet come. And indeed, as humanity's own probes ventured further, the legacy of Atlas accompanied them. Ships sent to interstellar space carried plaques etched with its image, side by side with maps of our solar system and recordings of human voices. Just as earlier generations had launched golden records aboard Voyager, so too the descendants of those explorers inscribed Atlas into their offerings to the cosmos. It was a gesture of kinship. We had once been visited, and now we sent ourselves outward as visitors, carrying the memory of that fleeting encounter. Even if no one ever found those records, even if they drifted in silence forever, the act of inscribing the comet alongside humanity's story gave meaning to the journey. Yet conspiracy theories still survived, mutating across centuries. Some fringe groups claimed Atlas had been no comet at all, but a disguised ark carrying beings who now lived unseen among us. Others insisted that it had planted invisible seeds in the solar system, waiting to bloom when the time was right. These beliefs rarely held sway in mainstream culture, yet they persisted on the margins, proof of how fertile the soil of ambiguity can be. In a universe where certainty is rare, suspicion finds purchase easily. Atlas, by refusing to yield closure, had become a permanent field where both wonder and paranoia could grow. And so the comet lived on, long after its physical body had vanished into interstellar space. It lived in art, in law, in religion, in science, in the whispered stories of children. It had become archetype, myth, metaphor. Whether probe or rock or something in between, it had transcended classification. It had become, in the end, less about itself and more about us, about how we react to mystery, how we turn silence into story, how we carry questions across generations. Atlas had entered our skies once and left, but in leaving it had entered our souls, a permanent guest in the house of imagination. And as humanity pressed outward, as ships set sail for distant stars, settlers carried the legend with them. They named stations after it, carved its image into hulls, sang its story in songs of departure. For in every journey into the dark, Atlas was remembered as the first to show us what it meant to be visited, to be observed, to be left with questions we could not resolve. In that sense, the silent traveller had not departed at all. It travelled with us still, not in orbit, but in memory, a reminder that the universe is vast, mysterious, and filled with possibilities yet to come. By the time human generations were being born and raised in vessels that no longer orbited the sun but wandered the deep gulf between stars, Atlas had become something more than myth. It was heritage. Children who had never seen Earth's skies were still taught that once, long ago, a visitor from the dark had crossed the system of their ancestors. The story was woven into lessons alongside the basics of physics and navigation. Teachers aboard generational ships retold it with the same reverence once reserved for ancient epics. It came without warning, it lingered without explanation, and it left us with questions that shaped who we became. The young listened wide-eyed, as though the tale of the silent traveller explained not only the cosmos, but their own reason for voyaging outward. In the archives carried aboard these ships, vast digital libraries storing everything from scientific records to art, Atlas occupied a special shelf. Data from its passage had been preserved across centuries, encoded redundantly so no failure could erase it. Students could call up the grainy images, the spectral charts, the erratic brightness curves, and study them as if peering into the mind of the mystery itself. Debates staged in virtual classrooms mirrored those of centuries earlier. Was Atlas natural, a shard of interstellar ice, or was it a disguised construct? Even in the age of advanced simulations and machine-assisted reasoning, the verdict remained the same. No model fit perfectly. The comet refused to collapse into certainty. It had become, in effect, a permanent riddle, inscribed into the foundation of humanity's intellectual culture. Among the colonies that spread outward, Atlas was honoured in ways both practical and symbolic. Habitats orbiting distant stars named districts after it: Atlas Square, Coma Avenue, Silent Halo Park. Spacefaring guilds of navigators kept amulets shaped like comets, invoking the visitor's protection before long journeys. Pilots swore oaths beneath holographic projections of its trajectory, vowing to honor the legacy of humility and vigilance it represented. Even engineers, pragmatic by training, adopted Atlas as emblem. Some ships bore its stylized insignia etched into their hulls, a reminder that all exploration was born of questions that refused easy answers. In religion, the myth continued to transform. On far-flung worlds where settlers carved new spiritual paths, Atlas appeared as a cosmic prophet, silent, enigmatic, refusing to answer, yet shaping humanity by absence. Some sects called it the Quiet Angel, claiming that its silence was itself a form of revelation. Others framed it as a test, suggesting that civilizations are measured not by how quickly they demand answers, but by how gracefully they live with uncertainty. These teachings gained resonance in the long, quiet stretches of interstellar travel, where years passed in routine and the stars outside changed only slowly. In such silence, the story of Atlas was not only remembered, but embodied. Artists in interstellar culture found endless inspiration in the legend. On orbital stations, immersive installations allowed participants to walk alongside the comet, drifting in simulated darkness as faint halos of dust shimmered around them. On colony ships, choirs sang hymns that mimicked its rhythmic light pulses, their voices swelling and receding like the waxing and waning of its brightness. Poets compared it to the unspoken love between generations, the inheritance of questions passed from ancestors to descendants. Even playwrights staged dramas where Atlas was a silent character, influencing all events, never appearing on stage, yet present in every decision, every hesitation, every hope. The visitor had become a muse that spanned centuries and stars. But Atlas's influence was not only symbolic, it continued to shape policy. In interstellar councils where representatives of distant colonies met to decide how to handle new discoveries, the Atlas Protocol was invoked again and again. Share data openly, avoid premature declarations, honor the collective ownership of mystery. The protocol was not always followed perfectly. Politics remained politics, but its invocation showed the comet's deep imprint on governance. A visitor that had once been nothing more than a faint blur had become the guiding star for how humanity managed the unknown. Conspiracy theories, too, survived the centuries. In small corners of settlement networks, groups whispered that Atlas had not left at all, that it had split, leaving fragments hidden in the Oort cloud, or even disguised among artificial satellites. Others claimed that the object had seeded devices into the solar system, patient watchers that still listened. These beliefs persisted not because of evidence, but because of the hunger for certainty. For some, Atlas could never be allowed to remain undecidable. It had to be probe or plot. Ironically, such theories only strengthened its myth, ensuring that even doubt became part of its legend. For individuals, the memory remained personal. In letters preserved across voyages, colonists wrote of how they carried images of Atlas to remind themselves of home. A father aboard a ship to Proxima Centauri described how he told his daughter bedtime stories of the visitor, framing it as a friendly traveller who had paused to glance at Earth before continuing on. A poet on a distant asteroid settlement confessed in her journal that she wore a pendant shaped like Atlas because it reminded her that beauty need not be permanent to matter. These intimate accounts showed how deeply the legend had been woven into identity. Atlas was no longer just a comet. It was a companion woven into the psychology of a species spread across stars. As humanity expanded further, the legend of Atlas began to merge with the myths of new encounters. Other interstellar objects were found, some ordinary, some carrying their own anomalies. Yet each was always compared to Atlas, measured against the silent visitor that had first awakened global wonder. Even when new mysteries arose, Atlas remained the archetype, the template of ambiguity against which all others were judged. In this way, it became less a single event and more a foundation stone in humanity's cosmic self-image. And always the silence endured. No transmission was ever traced back to Atlas. No hidden craft was found. No definitive evidence of design was uncovered. It remained what it had always been, undecidable. But in that undecidability it gained immortality, for mysteries that resolve fade quickly, mysteries that endure become eternal. Atlas had become eternal. Its name was whispered in classrooms, sung in rituals, etched into treaties, painted in murals, coded into simulations, and retold in stories to children who had never seen Earth's skies. It had transcended the moment of its passing to become a companion across centuries. Perhaps somewhere in the cold dark Atlas still travelled, carrying its enigma into other systems, sparking other debates, seeding other myths. Perhaps other civilizations had seen it before us, or would see it after, and wondered as we had wondered. We could not know. But what we could know was that, for humanity, its visit had been enough to shift imagination forever. It had taught us that silence can be louder than speech, that absence can be more fertile than presence, and that the cosmos will always remain larger than our explanations. And so, in generation ships drifting far from the sun, in domes glowing faintly beneath alien skies, in minds that had never known Earth but carried its stories, Atlas lived on. Not as rock or ice or machine, but as legend, as question, as symbol of the vast, unending mystery that waits in the dark between stars. By the time humanity had spread across multiple star systems, establishing colonies not only around familiar suns like Alpha Centauri and Tau Ceti, but also in the dim light of red dwarfs and the glittering edges of spiral arms, Atlas had transformed into something more than myth. It was no longer just a story passed down from Earth. It had become an archetype woven into the shared identity of a scattered civilization. Across habitats where human voices mingled with machine minds, across cultures that had evolved new languages and rituals, Atlas remained a common thread, a reminder that no matter how far they wandered, they were all children of a mystery once glimpsed in their ancestral skies. The legend evolved differently in each place, like a prism splitting light into many colours. In the Centauri colonies, Atlas was remembered as the silent teacher, invoked in ceremonies when young navigators took their first oaths to chart unknown skies. On Tau Ceti's orbiting habitats, the visitor was imagined as a pilgrim who had walked past Earth on its eternal journey, and colonists painted its trail on their walls, a curve of glowing white across black stone. In settlements near distant pulsars, where radiation storms constantly reminded people of the universe's harshness, Atlas was spoken of as a reminder of endurance, a body that had travelled for millions of years yet remained whole enough to spark wonder. Each culture bent the comet into its own symbolism, but the core never changed. Atlas was the messenger of silence, the embodiment of mystery that refused to resolve. The scientific data, long preserved in archives that stretched across light years, was revisited again and again. AI-driven analysis had reached unimaginable sophistication, capable of modelling stellar chemistries and interstellar formation processes with exquisite precision. Yet even these systems could not erase the enigma. Every new algorithm returned the same conclusion. Atlas's anomalies could not be entirely explained by known processes. The object remained statistically improbable, balanced on the razor's edge between coincidence and intention. For scientists, this was frustrating. For philosophers, it was sublime. The inability to decide had given Atlas its enduring power. It was no longer simply a comet or a possible probe. It was a permanent question encoded into humanity's history, a reminder that some truths lie forever beyond reach. Artists of the far future carried its memory into new forms. Holographic theatres staged immersive performances where audiences floated inside projected comet of light. listening to choirs chant in rhythms that matched Atlas's brightness pulses. Sculptors carved vast shapes into asteroid surfaces, representing the traveller as a figure moving without face or form, defined only by absence. Musicians composed endless cycles, symphonies designed to repeat without resolution, echoing the way Atlas had offered data but no clarity. For many artists, the visitor was less a subject than a muse, the ultimate symbol of ambiguity, inspiring works that mirrored its refusal to give final answers. Religion adapted too. Entire sects emerged around the story, treating Atlas not as a divine being but as a cosmic parable. One order, known as the Custodians of the Silent Path, recited its story in meditation rituals, believing the silence of Atlas mirrored the silence at the heart of existence. Another sect framed it as a kind of cosmic scripture. The comet spoke no words, but in its refusal we learned humility. Pilgrimages formed where believers travelled across systems to stand in observatories that had once tracked it, gazing outward into the same darkness it had traversed. To them, the act of looking was itself sacred, a reenactment of humanity's shared wonder. Even non-believers respected the role of the visitor in shaping a spiritual vocabulary that transcended distance and culture. Politics also carried Atlas's imprint. In the councils where interstellar settlements negotiated treaties, the Atlas principle remained law, that ambiguous discoveries must be treated as shared heritage, not claimed by any one world. This principle was tested often, especially as new anomalies were found. Strange signals from pulsars, irregularities in planetary atmospheres, unexplained objects drifting between stars. Yet in debates, representatives would invoke Atlas. Remember the traveller who belonged to no one, and so belonged to all. Though political rivalries still ran deep, the principle gave a framework for cooperation, rooted in a centuries-old myth. It was proof that even a faint blur in the sky could shape civilization's laws across millennia. For ordinary people living light years apart, Atlas was less lore and more story. Families told it to children before sleep, shaping it into parables suited to their needs. On one world, parents spoke of it as a friend who passed silently, teaching patience. On another, they told of it as a wandering ancestor, proof that even the lonely void is populated by travellers. In artificial habitats drifting between stars, the story was told during festivals, lanterns released into domes to mimic the faint glow of its coma. Children grew up with these rituals as naturally as earlier generations had grown up with myths of heroes or gods. In this way, Atlas had become folklore universal across worlds. Conspiracy theories inevitably survived as well. Fringe groups insisted that Atlas had been an alien probe that seeded devices still hidden in human systems. Some cults declared that it would return in cycles beyond human comprehension, that its silence was only temporary. Others believed it had been watching, silently judging whether humanity was ready for contact. Most dismissed such ideas, but they thrived in the margins, feeding off the absence of certainty. For some, Atlas was too potent a mystery to be left alone. It had to mean something more. Ironically, this refusal to let the story rest only reinforced its cultural power. What made Atlas unique, even in the far future, was that it was not only a mystery but a shared mystery. Unlike private revelations or local legends, it had been witnessed by a whole planet, debated by billions, recorded across every medium of human culture. It was a universal story, one that transcended nation, language, and creed. Even when humanity scattered to the stars, the memory travelled with them, a rare, common bond across distance. In a galaxy where cultures evolved along divergent paths, Atlas remained one of the few myths that all could claim. And so, centuries later, Atlas continued its silent journey outward, unseen, unmeasured, unapproachable. Its physical body was gone from human instruments, but its presence lived in us. It was remembered not for what it was, but for what it refused to reveal. It had shown humanity that mystery is not a flaw in knowledge but a feature of existence, that ambiguity can unite as powerfully as certainty, and that sometimes the greatest teachers are those who never speak at all. Atlas had entered our skies once briefly and left, but in leaving it had become eternal, a companion not in orbit but in imagination, guiding humanity as it wrote its own story among the stars. By the era when humanity had spread so widely that the term civilization no longer meant one but many, scattered across dozens of star systems, each with its own customs and dialects, Atlas had ceased to be remembered as a single comet. It had become something greater, a cornerstone of cosmic mythology, invoked whenever the unknown appeared. Its name was spoken alongside the oldest myths of Earth, woven into liturgies and songs, cited in laws and treaties, painted into murals that lined the domes of colonies circling alien suns. To children born beneath unfamiliar skies, Atlas was not just a visitor from the past, but a presence in the present, a figure that walked silently with them wherever humanity ventured. The legend no longer centered on data, the faint smudges of photographs, the irregular curves of brightness, but on what those traces had come to mean. To some, Atlas was remembered as the silent witness, a traveller who had passed through our system to observe whether we were ready to step beyond our cradle. To others, it was the question, an embodiment of uncertainty itself, reminding us that not all riddles yield answers even after centuries of study. On colonies orbiting Proxima Centauri, storytellers described it as a wandering ancestor, a seed cast from the dawn of creation, pausing briefly among humans before vanishing again into the dark. These variations differed, but all shared the same essence. Atlas was the visitor who never explained itself, and in that silence, it gave us meaning. Art carried the memory forward with intensity. In the great rotating habitats of Vega, massive holographic performances recreated the visitor's passage, filling entire cylinders with swirling comet of light, while choirs sang in rhythms that mirrored the pulses of its brightness. On icy moons near distant dwarfs, sculptors carved vast effigies of Atlas into canyon walls, their glowing outlines visible from orbit, as if to remind every traveller that mystery itself had been given form. Poets in floating cities above gas giants wrote verses that stretched across languages, each line unfinished, refusing closure, echoing the ambiguity of the comet itself. Even in digital dreamscapes where humans shared collective experiences through neural interfaces, Atlas appeared as a symbol of endless wonder, a luminous body drifting just beyond reach, beckoning, withholding. Science too kept its vigil. Though technology had advanced beyond anything Earthborn astronomers of the 21st century could imagine, Atlas's original data remained part of every new analysis. Machine intelligences, vast, distributed, capable of mapping entire galaxies in simulation, continued to model the event, yet none could settle it. Each explanation faltered against the anomalies, the improbable choreography of its planetary flybys, the strange regularity of its emissions. For younger researchers, Atlas became a kind of initiation, the case study that proved the limits of even their most advanced instruments. Professors reminded students that science is not only about resolving mysteries, but about recognizing when mysteries refuse resolution. Atlas, they said, was the teacher that never stopped teaching. Religious communities evolved in its shadow. Entire faiths arose that centered their rituals around Atlas's silence. One sect called themselves the Pilgrims of the Coma, holding vigils where they sat together in absolute quiet, believing that to imitate the traveller's stillness was to glimpse truth. Another framed the visitor as a divine envoy, not sent to deliver doctrine but to provoke humility, to remind humanity that it is not the master of the cosmos. Even among secularists, the language of reverence persisted. Atheist philosophers described Atlas as the cosmic parable, the event that proved mystery could endure longer than empires, longer than even the memory of nations. It was not worship but respect, a bow to the vastness of what we do not know. Politics had also found utility in the legend. Interstellar councils governing hundreds of worlds invoked the Atlas doctrine when debating how to respond to new anomalies. The doctrine emphasized transparency, humility, and shared stewardship of the unknown. It reminded leaders that when Atlas passed, humanity had nearly torn itself apart with suspicion and secrecy. Now, across the stars, the story was cited as precedent. No world, no government, no corporation should claim ownership of mystery. Instead, the unknown belonged to all. This principle was not always followed. Ambition remained, but the fact that debates were framed in its name showed how deeply Atlas had shaped the ethics of exploration. For ordinary people, Atlas lived in festivals, stories, and songs. On the anniversary of its perihelion, lanterns were released in domes from Sirius to Epsilon Eridani, glowing lights floating upward in mimicry of its halo. Families told children that the lanterns represented questions, rising without answers, illuminating the dark. In marketplaces, traders sold pendants shaped like comets, charms said to bring safe passage. In theatres, storytellers dramatized its passage as if it had been a character, a silent traveller walking past Earth, glancing back once before vanishing. Children grew up knowing the name even if they knew nothing of orbital mechanics. For them, Atlas was less about astronomy than identity, a reminder that to be human was to live with mystery. Yet not all voices accepted its ambiguity. Conspiracy theories still flourished, mutating across centuries. Some fringe groups claimed Atlas had not left at all but lingered invisibly, cloaked in technologies beyond comprehension, still watching. Others argued it had seeded the solar system with hidden probes, devices waiting for humanity to reach maturity before revealing themselves. These beliefs gained a little traction in mainstream culture, but persisted stubbornly on the margins, proof of how powerful mystery can be in feeding suspicion. Ironically, even these distortions only strengthened Atlas's endurance. Whether revered as symbol or distorted into paranoia, it refused to fade. Perhaps the most striking transformation came in how Atlas was remembered not as an object but as dialogue. Across worlds, philosophers asked, was its silence itself the message? Was ambiguity not a flaw but a design, a way of inviting us to grow into questions rather than chase answers? They argued that perhaps the measure of a civilization is not in how quickly it solves mysteries, but in how gracefully it carries them. If so, Atlas had given us not data but a mirror. In our reaction to it, in our endless debates, we revealed ourselves, and in seeing ourselves we grew. By this time, humanity had encountered other anomalies, enigmatic signals, unexplained structures orbiting distant stars, even celestial events that seemed to defy physics. Each time, the shadow of Atlas fell across the conversation. Every mystery was measured against it. Every debate echoed its precedent. Was this new object another Atlas? Was it probe, rock, or something in between? In this way, the comet had become less an event than a framework, a template for how we approach the unknown. The original traveller was long gone, racing deeper into interstellar dark, but it remained the first archetype of ambiguity. It had taught us how to see. And so Atlas endured, across centuries, across stars, across countless cultures. It lived not as dust or ice, but as symbol, myth, doctrine, art, and question. It had visited once, briefly, silently, and left. Yet in leaving, it had remained forever. Humanity carried it into every settlement, every classroom, every song, every philosophy. It had become part of who we were, inseparable from our identity as a species that looks up and wonders. Atlas had been a comet, perhaps, or a probe, or something else. We never knew, and in never knowing we found meaning. Its silence had become our guide, reminding us that the universe is larger than our answers and richer than our certainties. By the age when human descendants inhabited not just nearby stars but clusters of systems stitched together by corridors of migration, Atlas had become less a memory and more a foundation stone of identity. Entire generations had been born who knew Earth only as a story, a distant birthplace they would never see. Yet even among these far-flung children of the stars, the legend of the silent visitor remained. It was recited in schools, invoked in rituals, etched into the design of monuments. Across countless worlds, Atlas was remembered as the first reminder that the universe speaks in silence, that the cosmos is not obliged to explain itself, and that wonder is strongest when it refuses to resolve. In these centuries, humanity had encountered many other enigmas, artificial-looking structures discovered in distant planetary rings, unexplained emissions near collapsed stars, strange voids where galaxies should have glittered. Each provoked debate, each generated theories. Yet every mystery was framed within the precedent of Atlas. People spoke of another Atlas when describing anomalies, as if the original visitor had become a category, a symbol for all things that resist explanation. Atlas had ceased to be one comet and had become the very archetype of the unknown. Artistic traditions reflected this evolution. In the luminous domes of colonies orbiting Sirius, entire festivals were devoted to Atlas, with dancers moving in slow circles that mirrored the object's trajectory through the solar system. On the worlds of Trappist-1, poets composed vast epics in interwoven languages, describing Atlas as a wanderer who passed silently through the heart of creation, leaving behind questions as gifts. Digital artists in machine-human collaborations created immersive experiences where participants drifted in simulated voids, following Atlas across infinite horizons, their senses wrapped in silence and light. Each interpretation varied, yet all carried the same undertone: awe, reverence, and the acceptance that the universe's greatest gifts are not answers but enigmas. Religion too continued to transform around the myth. Some sects had elevated Atlas to near-divine status, treating it as a cosmic messenger sent to test humanity's readiness. Others framed it as a parable, a reminder that creation is larger than comprehension. In monasteries orbiting red dwarfs, monks meditated on its silence, teaching that enlightenment lies not in solving the question, but in dwelling within it. Even secular philosophers found themselves adopting spiritual language when speaking of Atlas. They described it as a cosmic koan, a riddle that cannot be solved but must be lived. In this way, the visitor blurred the line between science and faith, becoming a bridge across belief systems. Politically, Atlas's shadow remained inescapable. Councils spanning light years invoked the Atlas Charter when drafting policies for exploration. The Charter insisted that any ambiguous discovery must be declared openly, not hidden by governments or corporations. It enshrined the principle that mystery is a common inheritance of all sentient beings. While the rule was not always followed perfectly, ambition and rivalry still shaped decisions. It served as a compass, reminding leaders that secrecy breeds suspicion, and suspicion fractures unity. The very fact that a comet centuries gone could still shape interstellar law testified to the depth of its imprint. Among ordinary people, Atlas lived in daily ritual. Lantern festivals were held in domes, lanterns rising until they dissolved against ceilings painted with stars. Children crafted models of the comet out of clay and ice, parading them in processions through habitat corridors. Songs about the silent visitor were sung during departures of ships, as if invoking its blessing for journeys into the unknown. In marketplaces, traders still sold charms shaped like glowing comets, promising protection in travel. To live in human society, wherever in the galaxy it was, meant to live in the shadow of Atlas. It was no longer an object, it was culture. But perhaps the most profound transformation lay in philosophy. Atlas had come to represent more than a mystery. It represented a way of being. Scholars wrote of the Atlas stance, the ability to live with questions without rushing to closure, to embrace uncertainty as fertile ground rather than deficiency. This stance was applied not only to science but to ethics, politics, even relationships. The silent visitor had taught humanity patience. It had shown that ambiguity is not weakness but strength, that to carry mystery gracefully is to grow in wisdom. In this sense, Atlas had become a teacher across all disciplines, shaping not only what humanity thought, but how it thought. Conspiracy theories, of course, had not died. Fringe groups still insisted that Atlas had been a probe, that hidden evidence was suppressed, that fragments still lingered somewhere in the deep. Others argued it had been a disguised ark carrying watchers who now lived unseen among humans. Though dismissed by mainstream science, such beliefs persisted, fueled by the enduring absence of certainty. Yet even these distortions revealed something essential. Atlas had become too important to rest. Its silence was so loud that it demanded endless interpretation. In a sense, the conspiracies were another form of reverence, another way of acknowledging its power. As humanity advanced further, building civilizations that spanned constellations, Atlas became a unifying myth. Among cultures divided by distance, language, and custom, it remained one of the few stories all shared. A child born on a world orbiting a distant star could still recognize the name, still know the story. It was one of the rare threads connecting all of humanity's scattered branches. Some thinkers even suggested that Atlas was the closest thing to a universal scripture humanity had ever possessed, not because it dictated belief, but because it provoked questions, and questions, unlike answers, can be shared without losing their power. In the quiet of deep space voyages, where generations travelled without certainty of destination, Atlas was invoked often. Pilots whispered its name during launch. Settlers carried its image into new worlds. Children grew up hearing that they were not the first travellers, that once, long ago, something else had crossed our skies in silence. This gave them a sense of kinship with the unknown, as though humanity itself was now part of a larger dialogue begun by the visitor. Atlas had come and gone, but it had made us feel less alone. And perhaps, in the end, that was its greatest gift. Not evidence of alien intelligence, not proof of design, but companionship. It reminded us that the universe is alive with wanderers, that silence is not emptiness but presence, and that even fleeting encounters can reshape identity. Atlas was gone, racing deeper into interstellar dark, but its legacy endured as long as humanity endured. It had become not just a comet but a mirror, reflecting our capacity for wonder, our hunger for meaning, our ability to live with mystery. And so, across star systems, across centuries, Atlas remained. A visitor once, a legend forever, a silent guide carried in our stories as we became wanderers ourselves. In the farthest eras of humanity's story, when our descendants had become unrecognizable to their ancestors, when bodies were adapted to alien gravities, when minds lived partly in flesh and partly in the lattice of machines, when cultures had diverged into constellations of identity scattered across thousands of light years, the name of Atlas still endured. It was spoken not as a mere historical note, but as a mythic anchor, a reminder of the time when the species was still fragile, still young, still learning to listen to the cosmos. Atlas was remembered as the first great silence humanity ever shared, the visitor who came and left without explanation, leaving behind only the endless echo of its mystery. By then, entire archives of cosmic anomalies had been built. Humanity had discovered megastructures orbiting stars, enigmatic signals pulsing from voids, even patterns in radiation that seemed to hint at other intelligences. Yet still, when confronted with the question of interpretation, people invoked Atlas. Is it another Atlas, they would ask, whenever an anomaly resisted classification. The word had ceased to refer to a comet at all. It had become shorthand for mystery itself. To call something an Atlas was to admit that it might never yield an answer, that it might be destined to live forever in ambiguity. The comet had transcended event and become category. And still, artists remembered it. On worlds orbiting distant suns, sculptors carved its trajectory into canyon walls, so vast that the curves could be seen from orbit. Poets recited epics where Atlas appeared not as a rock, but as a silent traveller cloaked in ice, carrying questions from the beginning of time. Musicians in drifting spacefaring choirs sang in rhythms that pulsed like its light curves, building crescendos that never resolved, echoing its refusal to explain itself. Even digital dreamscapes crafted by machine minds included Atlas as a recurring motif, a body of light that slipped past participants just out of reach, always present, never graspable. Across centuries, across stars, across cultures, Atlas remained muse. Religion had woven the legend into liturgy. In some faiths, Atlas was the quiet prophet, a messenger who spoke not through words but through absence. In others, it was the great witness, proof that the universe watches us without revealing judgment. Pilgrims still travelled to ancient observatories, on Earth, on Luna, on Mars, where the comet had first been tracked. They stood in silence beneath the same sky their ancestors once watched, knowing the visitor was gone forever, yet feeling its presence in the act of looking. Even non-believers sceptical of divine interpretation found themselves moved by its endurance. It was less a god than a mirror, reflecting humanity's hunger for meaning. Politically, the Atlas principle remained law. Councils governing clusters of systems invoked it whenever disputes arose over ambiguous discoveries. It mandated that mystery must be shared, not owned, that no anomaly belonged to a single world or corporation. Though rarely obeyed perfectly, its very invocation reminded leaders of the dangers of secrecy. Atlas had taught humanity that silence breeds suspicion, and suspicion fractures trust. To honour the traveller was to honour transparency. Even in politics, its shadow lingered. For individuals, Atlas had softened into folklore. Parents told children bedtime stories. Once, long ago, a visitor crossed our skies. It said nothing, it left no gift, but it changed us forever. Children would ask, will it come back? And the answer was always the same. No, its path carried it away into the dark, never to return. But then, after a pause, parents would add, perhaps others will. In this way, Atlas became a promise disguised as a loss. It told each new generation that the universe is alive with travellers, and that one day another might appear, carrying silence, carrying questions, carrying the gift of wonder. And perhaps that was Atlas's truest legacy. Not proof of alien life, not evidence of design, not certainty of any kind, but wonder. It had reminded humanity that answers are not the only treasures. Sometimes questions themselves are the inheritance. By refusing to resolve, it had become eternal. Its silence had echoed longer than any declaration could have. It had shaped science, law, religion, art, and philosophy. It had bound together civilizations scattered across light years with a single shared myth. It had shown us that the cosmos is vast enough to humble us, mysterious enough to inspire us, and silent enough to let us decide what meaning to make. Perhaps somewhere in the endless gulf between stars, Atlas still travelled. Perhaps it had already passed by other civilizations, sparking their myths as it had sparked ours. Perhaps it was only ice and dust, indifferent to all the meaning poured into it. Or perhaps it was more, an artifact, a messenger, a question deliberately sent into the void. We would never know. But in a way, the truth no longer mattered. For humanity, the legend had outlived the object. The visitor had become eternal in story, in memory, in imagination. And so, as ships crossed further outward, as generations were born and died beneath alien skies, Atlas remained. It was remembered not as a solved riddle, but as a companion, not as an answer, but as a guide. It had visited once, long ago, and left, but in leaving, it had entered us. We carried it into every world, every story, every horizon. It had become part of who we were. In the end, Atlas left us with only one gift, the reminder that the universe is not empty but alive with possibility, that silence can be as profound as speech, and that questions can bind us more deeply than answers. That gift endures still, whispered across stars, sung in rituals, painted in domes, written in treaties, carried in hearts. Atlas came once, and it will never come again. But its silence remains with us, eternal, reminding us every time we look into the dark. What else waits there, watching, travelling silent unseen, waiting to pass across our skies?